All right, here we go.
Okay.
You're
oh
on.
my gosh. I know, I just lost the screen. I'm back.
Oh,
It's a good way to start. Okay, we have 5 of the 7 members, so we definitely have quorum. So the first thing on our agenda is agenda and materials review. Here comes Michael too, that's good. Does anybody have anything to add or change within the agenda? We don't have minutes from last month, so we don't have to worry about that. But should we go forward with the agenda as it is? Okay, the only thing I'd like to add is maybe if we're very succinct through all of this, we could maybe end a little bit early. That's what I would like to go for. But I don't want to cut anyone off, but I do want to remind everyone that in order to get through everything, board members and other people here who are here to speak, if you could be succinct, that would be great. This isn't the time to get into a debate about certain issues, and it's just the time to focus on the cases. If we want to talk about the process of the community impact case generally, that's what we'll be doing in January. So we can leave any of those comments for January's case or meeting. So I think we can move on to public comment. Okay, Bernadette.
Thanks, Carolyn. Now is the time for public comment. Per the Civilian Review Board protocols, public comment may not be about the incidents or cases that we are discussing tonight. It is the intention of the Civilian Review Board to have further discussion regarding the community impact case processes and decisions at our January meeting. If after hearing our discussion tonight, you feel you have comments about the incidents and cases we are discussing tonight, we ask that you come to that meeting. Due to the length of our meeting, public comment tonight will be limited to 60 seconds. In order to speak, we ask that you raise your hand on the Zoom link. In order to speak, in the order you will then speak in the order that is recognized. If you cannot raise your hand in the Zoom link, we ask that you make a note in the chat, just state your name and that you wish to speak. The chat will not be used and will not be opened for attendees for the purposes of chatting or making public comment. The chat will only be used by attendees for the purpose of notifying the board that you wish to speak. This picture will raise a flag indicating you have 10 seconds left. At 60 seconds, you will be muted. So if you, this time, if you would like to speak, please raise your hand or state your name in the chat so we can find you. I see the first person to speak is Jack Rady. Hope I pronounced your name right.
You did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jack, you have 60 seconds.
Okay. Last night I listened to the city council meeting, heard a lot of public comments, some of which denounced the Eugene Police Department for the recent shooting of a gentleman who is involved in a domestic violence situation. Tonight I was able to look at the body cam footage from one officer and from a dashboard cam, and it was quite clear, as usual, the people who are denouncing the department should have waited until they saw the evidence, as the man was running at the officer with a knife and the officer was doing what he was supposed to, backing up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Sarah KD, you are now allowed to talk. You have 60 seconds. Sarah, are you there?
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes,
Okay.
I'm here. So 60 seconds. Well, I'm Eamon Cordeli's mother. And a month ago, you listened to the incident that happened in my living room. And I think the most important thing that you can hear from me, the mom, is trying to keep a young man with mental illness safe in this community is almost impossible. And to give me 60 seconds is right up there with trying to live here with this young man. So Bernadette, why did Rick Rosetta want to mention that Eamon had hit me previously when that had nothing to do with August 6th, and it was not a hit, and it did not involve the police? And yet somehow Rick Rosetta and you decided it was important to try and paint a picture of this poor young man trying to live in this community. He held up a knife as a 5-year-old would hold up a prop. And I resent how difficult it has been to live in this town. We even had senior and disabled services call and ask if we needed a restraining order on our son. Now, I can go on and on about living here with this young man, but until you understand what it's like to keep him off the streets and not wandering the streets, you will not be an effective review board.
The next person I have to speak is Barbara Kenney.
Hello, thank you. My name's Dr. Barbara Kenney, and I'd like to comment on the case also that Sarah just spoke about. My perspective is as a friend of the family. She said she had called to ask Cahoots to come to her house to help her convince her son to go to the hospital. He suffers from a brain disease, otherwise known as a mental illness, schizophrenia. People suffering from schizophrenia often have no understanding that they are ill or that they need to take medication to manage their symptoms. I just want to point out one aspect of the incident that demonstrates a huge culture divide between the police and the general public. One of the officers involved made what I considered to be a kind and sincere gesture. He called her to tell her they had resolved the situation and not to worry, that her son was okay and he wasn't harmed in the arrest. My friend's interpretation of son okay and not harmed was that they gently escorted a willing subject to the car and took him to jail, where he would be evaluated for his known psychiatric condition and sent to a hospital if necessary. Does that sound naive? Why is that naive? Why isn't that the way it is? When she walked into her living room, there was taser wire on the carpet, blood on her sofa, a broken lamp, broken knickknacks that had been her side furniture. This vision of violence haunts her to this day. In most community members' minds, son okay and not harmed would not be the words that would be used if their unarmed, nonviolent, scared, and ill loved one had been punched in the face, tased, and forcibly restrained by several athletic and lethally armed men in his own living room. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
I do not see any other hands raised, and I do not see anyone in the chat at this time that wants to speak. Am I missing something? There's one more person, Emily Carroll.
Hi, I'm Emily Carroll, also speaking on behalf of Eamon. I'm Eamon's older sister. I'm 14 years older. Growing up with Eamon, he was a very kind, very quiet, unassuming young man, very musically talented, very athletically talented. He played sports through South Eugene, an incredible runner, had high hopes of going on to Division I college. What I'm speaking about right now is when you're a parent of a child who is athletically involved, academically involved, you have a huge support system. And what I've noticed is that when you have a child with a mental disability, you have no support system. So I'd like to just keep that in mind when we look at these cases, that there is very little support when you're used to having those in a regular family under normal circumstances. So thank you.
I also have a note in the chat that Paul Daly is going to speak using Sarah's computer. Paul, are you there?
All right, I'm there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'll just throw in a little bit here and I'm Eamon's dad, I guess, the understanding, and I know police have had, many have had training, but it seems that this stuff to understand was or very little considered. Number one, Eamon is often unable to understand something when a simple conversation. Difficult expressing his thoughts, and it gets jumbled and it makes no sense to most people half the time. But he's often tuned out, tuned out in the sense that I can ask him a question 4 or 5 times and he's never heard it. I have to tap him on the shoulder. I say, Eamon, Eamon, and he may come to because he's the hallucinations, voices, really thoughts jumbled in his mind about trying to solve some problem, his problem, very confused, fears, unable to respond to questions. So this comes down to police. Unable, if someone asks him something or a policeman asks him to do something, to follow a procedure, to sit down or this, he may not even hear it. You may look at him, but he won't hear it. So this has all kinds of implications, I think, for police operating, handling people with mental illness on the street or in any situation they come into, is not considering that they may not be understood. Yeah, and there's some other things there too that, you know, now he's afraid for a few minutes with police. For now, this may be forever because of this incident. You know, so we're going to try to work with them on that, but asking them for help in the future, that may be out the window. Sad to say. Thank you.
At this time, I have no other people that have indicated by raising their hand that they would like to comment, and no one has indicated in the chat that they would like to comment. So if we'll be closing the chat at this time and move to the next agenda item.
Thank you, Public and Bernadette, for leading us through that. Leah, are you closing the chat? You're muted. I think you said I am though. Okay. You're not muted.
I have to make you guys not co-host again, so it's gonna take a minute.
Okay. The next thing on our agenda is comments from board members and commission liaisons. And I think since we're going to have that order for speaking tonight, we can just follow that same order now. And if Rick shows up, he can jump in. So Bernadette, you're muted.
I appreciate Eamon's family coming back and speaking tonight. I know that over the time that we've been on, that I've been on the Civilian Review Board, the issues regarding mental health and how our police officers are trained in crisis intervention has evolved, but it doesn't mean there's not more room for improvement, that we need to recognize that a person with mental illness sometimes has the same difficulty understanding police directions as someone who is deaf or blind or doesn't speak English as their first language. And it's challenging. I really appreciate that we have Cahoots to help us, but I also recognize the need for Cahoots' safety and being dispatched through the Eugene Police Department. But I appreciate the family's time to come back and let us know their thoughts on this process. That's all. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jose.
Comment.
No comment? Okay. Lindsay.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank you all for making public comment tonight. I think it's critical that we hear from you. I'm sorry that we couldn't hear from you at the same time when your case was being discussed, and I will continue to advocate for that rule to be changed, just so that you know that's beyond the purview of the CRB itself. So there are other things we have to do to change that rule, but I think it's important for you to be able to speak at the same time that you listen to the discussion that we have about your case. So I'm sorry that that couldn't happen, and I appreciate that you took the time to come to this meeting. My general comments about tonight's cases, we're gonna talk about a lot of things, but I realize there's just a couple broad things that I wanted to say. One, it was helpful to see all of this at once, even though there's hundreds of incidents and many things that were going on in 3 separate nights, that it was helpful for me to see it all at once because I had fewer concerns by Sunday than I did on Friday. And so it looked like some learning was happening on the fly over the course of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and that things were getting better in terms of my expectations of officer response. So it was helpful to look at this all at once. In terms of the police commission report, we got an annual report from the auditor and looked at the use of force report from 2019. We're kind of playing catch up. And so you all are very familiar with all that. So there's not really anything to report back to you all, but just that that's what the police commission did in their last meeting last week. Thank you all for being here.
Lindsay, have there been any ad hoc committee meetings since our last meeting?
There have been several. I'm gonna pause for a minute and think about. So there's the ad hoc committee, and then there's also subcommittees of the ad hoc that are meeting. The last ad hoc committee meeting, sorry, I'll have to think about it for a minute. I've been watching the subcommittee meetings too, and so they're all kind of jumbled together. I will say that Rick is sitting on the subcommittee that's looking at civilian oversight. They will be meeting again tomorrow night to discuss the civilian oversight system and try to put forward recommendations that the ad hoc committee can make motions and then vote on. I think we're hopefully getting closer to the point where we will actually be making motions and voting on things. And in closing comments, if I can think about some more specific details from the group meeting, then I'll do that. Sorry, there's a lot of information in my head right now. Thank you.
Michael, you are next.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you also to the people who came and gave public comment today. It's always nice to hear public comment, even when it's critical. I think that certainly my first year on the board, we never got any public, much less public comment. So it's nice to see the higher level of engagement with what we do. I just wanted to start off with use my opening comments today to say that I live downtown. I'm 13th and Lincoln, and so I could hear most of what was going on the weekend of the events that we're considering today. And certainly the actions against property and public order on May 29th are ones that would concern most Eugenians. But I took issue with the description of them as violence throughout the materials for tonight. However the law defines violence. I'm not a lawyer, so I get to say things that aren't strictly following the law. However, those aren't the things that we're considering, even though those are the context, right? The totality of the circumstances for the things that we're considering. We're reviewing investigations of actions committed against people. And those actions against people were committed by the institution that claims to keep us safe and that demands that we trust them with the legal right to kill us. So civilian oversight of law enforcement has never come into existence in anywhere where it exists. It has never come into existence except in response to public outcry against police corruption and or police abuse. In Eugene, the current robust system that we have, most people on this board, I assume, know, came into existence in response to first police attacking protesters, environmental protesters in 1997. The city manager called for an investigation of the police department's actions in that. That investigation was conducted by the Oregon State Police. No EPD officers participated in that investigation. They all refused to cooperate. They refused to testify. They refused to participate in a state police investigation of their actions. Then there was a move by the city council to create civilian oversight for law enforcement in this town. The police department fought that. They've campaigned hard against the ballot initiative that would have created a civilian review board and a police auditor's office. At the same time that they were fighting against that ballot measure, people within the department were refusing to investigate and take seriously accusations of sexual assault and rape by Eugene police officers. So there was this insistence that internal affairs was enough, at the same time that there was a cover-up of serious wrongdoing, which is why when the ballot measure came up again, it passed overwhelmingly. Eugenians overwhelmingly supported the creation of our current system in response to those crises with Eugene law enforcement. It disturbed me to hear in some of the materials for today that Portland was used as this justifying example that, oh, we didn't use nearly as many pepper rounds as they used. Portland residents just voted 82% to 12% to dramatically overhaul their oversight system for their police department, because they don't approve of how the Eugene or the Portland Police Bureau has been responding to protests. Now, I think that our police department, by and large, has done a much better job. Partly because we didn't use as many pepper ball rounds. Partly because the police department has taken a more hands-off approach after the first 3 days. So I just wanted to put all it out there, because civilian oversight of law enforcement this isn't like my thing. And I think it's important context for, especially given how many people we have from outside of, from the public watching today, to have some sense of the history of what we do and why we do it.
Rick, welcome. We are in the middle of giving our board member comments, and Lindsay gave a brief ad hoc thing, but she's going to add more later. So if you want to add anything, I think that's appropriate. And you are next in line to give a comment, but we can come back to you if you'd like to settle for a little bit.
I think we'll probably have a full night without me making a comment now.
Okay. So Bill, and then I'll make my comment, and then we can move on.
Thank you, Carol, and I'll make mine short. I just want to thank the family for coming and speaking and letting us hear a little of their thoughts. And I agree, especially with the young person that the sister that said that there isn't a great support mechanism for people that suffer from these diseases. And I think that's something that the state should be forced to look at and help families and people in these situations and do that. And that's where I would recommend that you focus your time to do that, because I think it's important to get funding for those things back. Thank you.
I will also be quick with my comment. One thing that I noticed while watching all of the videos and going through all the stuff is I am, again, very, very grateful that Eugene Police uses body-worn cameras and that the officers seem to have bought into that. I think that it really helps us gain a good understanding and accurate understanding of what happened rather than just hearing different sides of the story. And I'm going to, again, talk about how I think this should be public for everybody, and the way to get these videos out to the public would be to contact representatives in state government. So I'm going to encourage people to do that. I encourage officers to do that, and I encourage citizens to do that, civilians to do that, because I think it can help officers, as our first commenter said, it helps them get, it helps what they did be cleared up to the public in a way that is beneficial to them as well as to the public. That is my comment. So it is time for the incident reviews, the investigation into overall events from May 29th to 31st. And I think Leah or Jason and Ryan are doing that. Leah?
So first, we're actually going to do a quick overview of how we broke this down, just largely for the members of the community who are here, but also just sort of to, I was going to say reorient you, but I somehow doubt you all have been doing much else over the last 2 weeks. So I apologize for that. And let's get started. I am going to share my screen. please let me know if there are issues with that. So obviously this all occurred the last weekend of May. We got a lot of community interest and community comments from various perspectives. We knew there were going to be a lot of force reports, a lot of video, a lot of evidence to review as part of this, and sort of quickly realized that this was a bigger project than we had ever encountered, or at least in my time in the last 10 years. So what we did was we created incident reviews to do a high level look at each night overall. So the night of the 29th, night of the 30th, night of the 31st, with the idea that we would then extract certain specific incidents for further scrutiny or for, you know, classification of to be determined depending on what happened. So as a result, what we have given to you all are the incident reviews with the overview, the sort of general incident reviews. There's an incident review or a catch-all for complaints about chief level decisions, which are outside the jurisdiction of our office per ordinance. We kind of included that in that complaints about the curfew, for instance, because that's a city manager level decision. That is the focus of, that will be reviewed as a result of litigation outside of this process. We also had 6 allegation of misconduct investigations that you'll all talk about tonight, 2 incident reviews of specific incidents, 4 inquiries, and 1 service complaint. I want to note here that there is still some video from the weekend that is occurring. EPD offered us a lot of significant additional resources to get through this rather massive project. And one of those was having a quality assurance person to look over all of the over 600 hours of videos. So there is some of that that's still occurring. In the event that anything else gets discovered, it will be presumptively treated as a community impact case with a similar review and a similar timeline. But given that this was largely finished in the interest of timeliness and justice, we felt it was important to bring it to you now. So, decision points that you all will be focusing on tonight. Because it's a community impact case, the ordinance has different requirements. This isn't sort of your typical case review. So we need to know if you concur with the chief's preliminary adjudication. Just to be clear, this refers to the chief's adjudication, not mine or Mark's or Stacy's or anybody else's recommendation. It's the chief's. You can also, these are all and or points, by the way, per ordinance. These are all sort of options for you. You can make recommendations on handling of the complaint in the investigative process, policy procedure issues. That's sort of more your typical wheelhouse of recommendations of what you think needs to come out of this. And then under certain specific circumstances, you can ask the city to reopen the investigation. That is where the investigation was incomplete or inadequate, and investigation will likely change the outcome, or the adjudication is not supported by substantial evidence. I want to note also that you're all very small on my screen right now, and I'm frankly not sure how to change that. So if you want to jump in, or if I'm saying something, please just do that, because I'll hear you before I see you. And so, generalized incident reviews. So as you all reviewed and looked at, the first 2 case numbers were for the night of May 29th. We sort of had to reorganize things as they came in, but we had a significant number of community complaints saying there was too much enforcement action. We had also a lot of complaints saying there was too little. The 3rd case number looked at Saturday and Sunday night. And then the 4th case number looks at those complaints that we don't have jurisdiction over. So of course, now that I've introduced you to the decision points, we start with one where it's different. So for the incident reviews, because there isn't an adjudication, what I think we need to do here to satisfy the requirements of the ordinance is look at recommendations, see if there are things that were covered in the incident reviews that you think should have been extracted or sort sort of your opinion overall about those generalized high-level investigations. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can all see each other. And take it away. Oh, I had your comment order on there. Oops, I'm sorry. Carolyn, you still have that, right?
I go
We do.
first.
Yeah.
Bernadette
Do we,
goes
do we,
first.
if we all know, it's Bernadette, Jose, Lindsay, Michael, Rick, Bill, Carolyn. It's in alphabetical by last name. So feel free to jump in when it is your turn.
Also, there's a bar in between the share screen and our pictures, and you can slide that sideways and make the share screen smaller and the people bigger. Just if somebody doesn't know that. So
Work on that.
I would like to start by offering some thoughts regarding this investigation. Tonight, many people are listening, hoping that we are going to right a wrong. Some think the lack of enforcement by police during the protests and riots was unacceptable, that they were not policing that night. Others think the police should have allowed protesters to march unabated. What I have found over the years on serving this community is the passions held by opposing points of view can be very challenging to bridge. Some will walk away from this meeting feeling that we have once again not supported the officers of the Eugene Police Department. Others hearing the same thing will walk away and say that once again we have rubber stamped the actions of the department. I would ask each of you to listen carefully as we navigate this discussion tonight and listen for the things that contradict your preconceived biases of what we as a board are doing. Look for the things that your own side could have done differently, could have done better. When the events of May 29th unfolded rather rapidly, police officers that were accustomed to stopping crimes or investigating the aftermath of crimes were told to stand back as businesses were looted. I think we all need to think about that. Think about asking a firefighter not to fight a fire, a teacher not to help a struggling student, a doctor not to hold the hand of a dying patient. Why? Because it's not safe. Then think about all the people that went home after the many encounters over the weekend. The couple that was trapped in their car surrounded by a mob. The officers who couldn't get to them. The officers who spent 12 to 15 hours on a shift unable to protect that couple because they couldn't get to them. The officer sitting in a car surrounded while their windows were broken out, and that they had to get up and do the same thing again for 2 more days and nights. And think about how any of those people interacted with their families after those experiences. The individuals that broke out the windows, the couple caught in the mob, the officers on the front line. Each of them went home and relived those events. Tonight, we will talk over the course of the evening about 16 different internal affairs cases. Of those 16 cases, 10 were investigated as a result of action taken by the police department or the auditor's office, not the result of a citizen's complaint. We need to remember that. In one of those cases, cited as a citizen complaint, the officer had self-reported at the end of their shift their actions, and that is the foundation of one of the complaints. That means 75% of the cases we are reviewing is because the police department took the action to review the actions of their officers and command staff to see how they could do better. This was the first significant protest or riot in Eugene in greater than 10 years. I don't know the average length of service for the officers, but from my review of these cases, the officers, many of the officers that were there that night have not been confronted by the situation. So yes, you will hear some members on this board say policies were violated. That will make some of you angry. It may make some of you pleased, but none of you satisfied. I hope each of you listening recognizes that we, as a volunteer board, have spent the last 2 weeks poring over reports and videos and audio of 20 or 30 or even more hours. I thank you for your engagement in the process. I hope that you will listen carefully for all of us and how all of us can do better. I appreciate the officers that spent the time investigating. I think the auditor's office did an excellent job shepherding these cases to come together to give us a full and concise picture of the weekend. And I think, as someone said earlier, as the weekend went on, they clearly were learning things as it was going. And I think that that learning curve will continue to go. Thank you.
Can you remind me again, since there's just so much information going through my mind, at the end of a COVID year, this specific round of comments. Are we on cases now, or are we speaking general?
Thank you for asking. So we are on the general cases. So the first 4 tabs in your cases, in your case file, in your case book, are those sort of generalized incident reviews that overlooked those nights. Does that make sense? And then we'll go into the specific allegation investigations after this.
Okay. I think because I'll have a lot more to say on individual cases. And because I think everybody will have a lot to say, I'll keep my comments here pretty short. You know, I was less interested in the cases about say like profanity, although I would love to discuss those in more detail, and more interested in thinking about, again, I want to, for everybody that's attending here, I want to say that when I make my comments on specific incidents, I feel like, as somebody who's employed by the state of Oregon and interested in building community here, that the higher power that I feel that I'm beholden to is that of public and democratic community. And I'm interested in asking what it will take for us to create civil institutions that work with us rather than against us. And I hope that my comments will be considered in the spirit of calling people in rather than calling them out. I want to say that I guess I want to preface before we get into the cases that I don't know how I would respond if I was an officer responding to these cases. I will say that I don't know that property crimes are necessarily equal to commensurate with taking human life and damaging flesh. So that's where my specific comments will be coming from.
Couldn't agree more, Jose. And I've said the same thing at the police commission table multiple times since this has come up. I actually, while I absolutely don't condone the destruction of other people's property and think that people who do that should be held accountable for the laws that they break, if intervening puts human life at risk, I think that's a bad deal. I totally agree that I fall on the side of protecting human life, officer life, community member life over preventing property damage. Those are just separate categories of things. And I know that I've heard Chief say months ago when making decisions that first night, particularly when it seemed like there were a lot of people who were pretty overwhelmed by what was going on, and it was very chaotic, that when resources weren't available to stop property destruction safely, then property was allowed to be destroyed. And personally, I support that judgment just as a person. That's my personal opinion. While at the same time not saying it's okay to destroy property, just to be clear. I can imagine that soundbite getting edited down later. So looking at the overall incident review of May 29th. So there was just one, I have no idea what really to do with this. So I'll be honest. And I think mostly I just want to understand more and get other people's professional perspectives on this. There was one piece of video that came up that was an officer using a 40 millimeter round, like the impact weapons, the less lethal weapons, that we didn't review anywhere else and didn't have like a specific incident review or inquiry opened, but sort of gave me pause, and I don't know what to do with that other than to say that I think I would like it if it was possible to look at it more closely, and I would like it if it's possible to have some something written, like explaining, I don't know, maybe what someone other than me sees when they look at it. And so I know that you all on the review board have spent hours, like I have, just combing through tons of footage. And so you may or may not have seen this particular incident. And you know, so may not share my concerns about it at all, but I'm just going to kind of plunk that comment here. And if we need to come back to it to discuss it further, I'm happy to, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as I can while maintaining anonymity, etc. So that's all I have for this section.
Hi. So as you can see, I deconstructed my binder, and I had also misread the agenda. So I saw I had like coded the agenda with the case numbers, and I got confused between incident reports, because obviously my brain just thinks differently organizationally than Leia's does. But I did manage to find the things that we're talking about. I thought we were talking about them later. And one thing that came up for me here was something that was kind of a running concern through several of them, which was there were different. Well, there are two things that are kind of inconsistent throughout the various reports that we've read. Actually, there's more than that, but the two that strike me as sort of like runningly inconsistent were the definition of riot. There's, you know, one officer will say, "Oh, Eugene's had so many riots over the last 20 years. I've, you know, been a million of them." And then someone else will say, "We've never had one until now." We were both people on EPD for the same amount of time, and so clearly there's some difficulty in understanding how to understand that word in relation to different things, including, right, what's happening at Washington and 7th versus another group that is marching apparently non-violently, maybe tagging graffiti, which doesn't seem particularly violent to me, going from market of choice to campus, right? So there's like two different things, and one is like definitely riot from my perspective. Another, I'm not sure. Maybe there's a technical definition because of, you know, police declare a riot. I'm not sure. But so there's a riot. The other thing that gets different contradictory explanations or inconsistent explanations throughout is why police wanted to prevent protesters from reaching the U of O campus on, I believe this is on the 31st. So this was a couple of days after the worst of the looting, right? So it's not clear to me that there was, I wasn't leaving the house, but it's not clear to me that there was a lot of significant property damage or looting happening on the 31st. And there was a group of protesters that were moving from the Market of Choice parking lot toward the University of Oregon campus. According to at least one report, there were a significant number of students among this group. And at one point, the police, or the chief, in their memo states that, can I quote from the chief's memo? Okay. That the University of Oregon Police Department did not have the resources to manage a crowd of that size and potential for violence and destruction. The University of Oregon separate jurisdiction would have had, et cetera, would have had to require mutual aid. But else, that's the only place where I saw that explanation. Elsewhere, there were other explanations given, including an interview with a lieutenant who said that we were all concerned that protesters would gather more participants if they were able to reach the campus area. And then there were other places where it was simply stated this was a priority. We were told not to let them reach the University of Oregon campus. At one point, it was suggested that protesters would be harder to follow once they reach campus because right, barriers to Bearcat, right? You can't run a Bearcat through the middle of campus without causing a lot of property destruction. So I was a little, one might be forgiven for suspecting that this might have been perhaps a call from President Shell saying, not that that happened, but one might, but that's a reasonable paranoia to have. And so it just, given the level of force that was used in this particular case by the police, for pretty much the sole purpose of preventing protesters from reaching the U of L campus, protesters who were not looting. That disturbed me. I wish there had been a consistent explanation at least.
Thank you, Michael. I think my comments for these first few cases, I would like to echo what Bernadette said. I think we had operating factors and emotions that kind of operated in opposite directions during the process. There was a high amount of emotion displayed by the early people involved in the protests. The officers were, I think, appeared to be somewhat overwhelmed, not necessarily by numbers or anything like that, but just having to go through this process for the first time. It was a new experience for them. And so they had a learning curve that they had to deal with. And as the days went on, they began to build up their skill level and their ability to handle the pressure that they were under. And that combined with the fact that they were probably pretty tired after 2 full days. On the 31st, they were probably starting to wear out a bit. And so you had these movements during the process where some people might have been more irritable than others at various times during the process. And I think it led to some confrontations that probably would not have happened had it been an isolated incident rather than something that lasted 72 hours or whatever it was for the period of time that it lasted. It struck me that there were certain officers whose names, whose identities are involved in a number of these cases, where they were given the assignment of handling a 40mm launcher, or they were given the assignment of being a pepper ball operator, or they're being given the assignment of being someone who's in face-to-face, hand-to-hand situations with protesters on the street, who were not given any choice about what to do. They were called in to go from one part of the city to the other and told, make arrests if possible, keep people from going here, keep people from going there, make sure that they go this way. And they had to do what they had to do. And I don't think that as a matter of practice, we ought to be forcing them to make other decisions other than to follow what their directions are. And so I see the individual officers on the street as having some limitations on what they could do individually, whether they could make choices about how they handle themselves. And there are policies in line that they had to abide by, that if there were been better policies, maybe it'd been a different outcome. That's really all I have to comment on at this point with the individual, with this group of cases. I do think that by and large, the officers showed a growth of how they handled the situation from the beginning till the end. That's all I have.
Thank you, Rick. So I'm trying to work through, and I think everybody has brought up some wonderful points. And what I guess I have to say about this first set of group of incidents that we're looking at is that how difficult it is in our world to allow people to protest wrongs and things that they think need to be changed within our society, versus also protecting the public and the rights of people and their property to do that, and to do that, and where incidences happen so quickly and they have to react to them, and maybe they're understaffed at the time, they don't have the resources to be able to easily watch and monitor and make sure things don't get out of hand. You have to, as you read through these, and it is, and I think we saw this, through this process, is it did get better every day when there was more time to plan, more time to think about it. Doesn't mean every decision that was made through this process was right, but I think at the time of how this was happening and unfolding, people were trying to make the best decisions they had. And Rick makes a great point about when we look at some of these individual instances where officers were assigned to do certain things and they were told to protect or to go to certain areas and do certain things. That's all they had available to them to use and to do. And so, so we have to think about that, and also think about that, for some of these that we're looking at, these officers were involved in this for 4 hours straight at times, especially on Friday night, as we looked at some of these videos that happened at 2 o'clock in the morning with some of the instances. I mean, these are the 4 to 6 hours they have been working this and dealing with this incident. So, but I think that it's really difficult when we can sit back and look at these things 6 months later and say what they did was right or wrong. I think we need to remember to look at how that incident unfolded and look at that whole night, and again get back to the totality of the situation and what was being determined then, and what is a peaceful protest. Since I attended many which I considered to be peaceful protests, and none of them ended up and I left like this.
Thank you, Bill, and everybody. I'll be quick. One thing that struck me watching all the footage and hearing the protesters talk to, call to dismantle the police and defund the police, and using more colorful language than that about the police. And then the next, hearing the police officers themselves talk about how understaffed they were and how this was a difficult situation because of how few officers were available. And I think that speaks to how few are on the police department generally. And I think hearing those two complaints about everything together really speaks a lot to where we are right now. And I think in order to enact change, sometimes systems need to be dismantled. And I don't know which way we need to do that at this point, and I don't know that it's possible at this point, but I do want to say that having this discussion tonight with so many attendees listening is important. And I think, speaking to what Bernadette was saying, people are going to walk away unfulfilled from this, listening to this conversation. But I think the fact that we have it is a really good thing. And I really appreciate people being here to listen. Leah, it's your turn.
Do you want me to comment, or do you want me to do the next case, Carolyn?
Bernadette's hand is up, but I was saying to do the next case.
We don't have any decision making. We don't have to make any decisions on this particular case, agenda item. Correct?
Unless you want to.
No.
But you have to. If you want to make recommendations or you want to talk about opening, reopening, we can. Those are the things that are available to you. I see Mark wanted to speak, so I'm going to stop talking because he's my boss. You're muted, Mark.
He never knows how to unmute himself.
That was general.
Sorry. Hold the space bar.
You're gonna miss me when I'm gone. Leah did so much work on this case. I got to do my ride back in 2001 in Cincinnati, and it's really a ton of work, and she just did a tremendous amount of work here, almost all the work. To Lindsay's question, probably a day or two after we started to get the spreadsheet of the things that were fired at people and gas canisters that were thrown. at that point in time, I don't think that we had come to an agreement on some of the timeframes, as you know, and the public may not know. We only have a certain amount of business days to start classifying complaints. In addition, and especially with regard to the 40 millimeter impact weapons, on two of those occasions for the 29th, they were entered almost immediately into blue team, which for us at that point in time, because we hadn't had the discussions about extending our timeframes, we needed to take a look at those and became aware of those. So I primarily watched those videos and made the classification decisions either based on the video or the blue team. As we know, on Sunday evening, SWAT members don't wear body cams, so we had to go based on the written word. If there's a case, and it's hard to talk about now, that where I might have missed something on the other three uses of the 40 millimeters, if there's a way that that can be brought to our attention and we can look at it again as an incident review, I think that's certainly possible. I probably didn't see all the film for especially around the Broadway area, I think is where the primary areas for the use of the 40 millimeters were. I remember one officer very specifically who I thought was, well, two of them that I thought were very deliberate in their decisions to use those. And given the volatility of that particular situation, especially as they got down to Lawrence Street, I thought it was it fell within policy in those circumstances. But again, I'm certain that I probably did not see every minute of footage on that. So at some point in time after this or during that can be brought to my attention. We can revisit that. And if we did miss something, I apologize. And then at that point in time, at the spreadsheet, suddenly we get drawn to the volume of pepper balls that were fired, especially by a couple individuals that Friday night. So I know that after having looked at the 40 millimeters and thinking, okay, I understand these particular situations from Friday night, not Sunday night, but Friday night, we pivoted pretty quickly to the hundreds of pepper balls that were shot by people. And I think then we really started to look at that, because at first blush, when you saw that spreadsheet, it was I don't know what the right word is. It certainly took our attention. And then same with the gas canister. So that's sort of how it played out in the beginning. And then as we went down the road and we were given more time frames and things, then Leah got involved in that. But we felt like, at least within that first week, that there were a number of decision points that had to be made fairly early on, particularly if we were going to bring forward allegations at that point in time.
I see Lindsay has her hands up. And just the one.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, if you're offering, Mark, if that's a possibility, I have all the details so I can point you to the exact video that I would. And like I said, I don't know if any policy was violated. I just would like something a little more formal written up from your perspective about what you see and how you would characterize it. When I looked at the use of force report and I looked at the video, I personally wouldn't characterize it the same way as the report did. And so it would make me feel more comfortable if you would be willing to look at that and get back to us. That would help me.
I will.
All right.
So do we need to ask if we concur? Because there aren't any, I mean, I guess the chief did adjudication, but should we move on to the next case, or do we want to reopen anything other than what Lindsay has already brought forward?
I mean, I'm not voting.
Okay, I guess maybe raise your hand if there is something else you'd like to reopen.
I guess I was
Generally.
unclear, partly because I guess we don't do a lot of incident reviews as opposed to allegations and service complaints. So the incident review that had the chief's memo attached, or at least that I attached the chief's memo to when I reconstructed my binder. Do we have a role? What is our role with that? I mean, it's not
Right. I think I included that really to make sure that you all have the full picture, but since our office doesn't have jurisdiction over that, neither do you. Yeah, so basically the ordinance calls out complaints against the chief go to the city manager, which is occurring with that set. And what I wanted to do was, what I promised you in June was a full picture of what happened. And I felt like that filled a gap that I wanted to make sure you guys got that information, those command decisions that I'm looking at. Okay.
Thank you.
Does anyone, I didn't see anybody else wanting to push anything on these. Is that correct? All right, I will share my screen and go on to the next one, if that works. Carolyn?
Yeah, I would like to point out that we're running a few minutes, about 13 minutes behind schedule. So I think that we'll be able to make it up throughout the evening, but let's still allot 40 minutes to this discussion. We'll just change it on our agenda to run from now until 40 minutes from now.
Sounds good to me. Okay, I am on. Bernadette, the trick you told me isn't happening, so we're just moving. Okay, so case one is, as you were all just referring to, there was use of a 40mm less lethal launcher on Sunday night. Supervisor A fired 5 different rounds at 4 different individuals over the course of the night. So that was 4 separate allegations of misconduct. The chain of command recommended that they were within policy. The auditor recommended that 1, 3, and 4 should be sustained and that 2 was within policy. And the chief's preliminary adjudication was within policy on all of those. So here we have the decision points. Carolyn, do you want me to leave those up?
I think the way that we'll go through this is we'll take our turns giving our insight and any recommendations we might have. And then at the end of that time, we'll just do a show of hands about whether or not we concur with the preliminary adjudication. And then we'll also do a hands up indication whether or not we think the investigation was incomplete or inadequate and needs to be reopened. So does that sound right, Leah?
That sounds great.
Okay, so if we're okay not having this up on the screen, I do think it's good to see each other.
I do too. Okay, I'll stop share. And I'm sorry, I meant to point this out earlier, but I forgot. You all know this from your emails, but the chief is here to listen to your input. I don't think this is the correct forum for any kind of sort of debate or engagement. He can answer questions if you have them, but I just wanted to point out that he's here to listen to your input. And I'll stop saying that and repeating myself.
I get to go? Oh, Mark has a question.
I don't have a question. I just, for the sake of our attendees, when you see the word sustained, that means that, and in this case, I was the only one that said sustained. It means that my opinion is that the officer violated policy, and within policy speaks for itself. But I just wanted to clear that up for the audience because I know we have a lot of new people, and that's what sustained means. Thank you.
Another clarification for our attendees is that we have agreed to use gender neutral pronouns for everyone we're talking about, including officers who were involved and the civilians who interacted with them. So we try our hardest to do that. It helps protect the anonymity of the officers involved. And so that's why we say they and them when we do.
So I think the investigation was thorough with regards to this first incident. I'm not sure that it was clear that when we're talking about a 40mm impact weapon, it is a sponge round, which is intended to slow a person down. And in this case, the officer was attempting to use it in order to take custody of a couple of people. I think my one concern, one question I wish had been asked was, I think the officer indicated in their questioning that it took a while to reload. But I would like to know like the length of time, because my one concern was in allegation number 3, when an individual was chased and they went towards a door. The weapon was launched at the individual. The individual was hit with it. The officer knows that the individual was hit because the person said ow, and they could hear it, and then went to a door. And my concern is if the impact weapon was intended to stop or slow a person down, following the person at that point, I think would have been a better course of action than stopping to reload, because it sounded like the officer was within about 20 feet of the porch at that point. And so that one was my concern with this case, as far as when the officer was using the weapon, or using the impact weapon. That was my concern on this one, is that not being real clear as to the amount of time it took to reload. But I had concerns about that second launch of the weapon. Otherwise, I have nothing further to add to this.
Okay. I'd like to, sorry, Mark.
I was just gonna, again, maybe out of turn, clarify for our attendees. It's called a sponge round. It's really looks more like a shotgun shell with a hard round plastic piece inside. And then the very top is sort of, since it's National Cupcake Day, sort of like the icing on the cupcake, if you will, if I may use an analogy there. So it's not just the tip is sponge. It's not entirely sponge.
I'd like to begin my comment with another question. Are we going to be commenting on each individually, or like all 4 at once right now?
However you want to. I think how all 4 at once is generally how we're doing it, but you can go through it individually if you'd like.
Yeah, not to contradict anything that you had said, Bernadette. I would just I had found myself highlighting. I don't know which page this on, but a section that says the risk of serious physical injury with a 40mm sponge round remains significant, and that's what is curious to me about how we discuss, the need for the use of force here. I like to come back to a comment that Michael made early on, and as to underscore something. Again, for everybody out there listening, I've been tasked with using a given set of parameters to evaluate incidents. So while I may not agree with them and agree with their premises, I have to go with what's written down here. Now, as a philosopher of language, I'm curious about the work that a word like riot does. And given that we know that decorum is a weapon that's been used against racialized subjects in this country, and given that we know that there is nothing more American than the violent destruction of private property, if we look back to the sort of foundational constitutive acts of this country. Again, I'm curious as to how the rhetorical work that the word riot is doing when it comes to justifying rounds that are, as written, at risk of serious physical injury, especially when people are retreating. And I think that that's what, when I come back to a sort of human response, a response that is like emotional and not necessarily logical, these are the kinds of things that I'm focusing on when I think about, again, something like somebody running away into a house or running at all, or in the same way that I want to put myself into the shoes of officers as much as possible, I want to put myself in the shoes of folks who might be demonstrating peacefully and given orders like move. What does move mean? Does move mean this way or that way? Disperse, what does disperse mean? I'm not sure that, I'm kind of thinking about this in the way that I'm working, because I'm a parent of a toddler right now. I'm like, okay, they're going to use everything against me. How do I know, how specific do I know I should be in that moment? And I know, and we all know that when our emotions are aroused and our blood, our body's chemicals in our brain are flowing freely, sometimes we don't hear things that we're supposed to hear, as one of the family members mentioned. And so, yeah, that's another thing that I had focused on and was interested in discussing. Again, maybe somebody with some law enforcement can weigh in here, that the commands, I'm interested in the commands that are given to protesters, and how, what are the quote unquote rules of engagement. I hope that those kinds of comments are clear, but I'll be brief and cut them off there.
Thanks, Jose. So I have issues with both the policy and also sort of the individual officer behavior. So I have lots of issues. I also have two other issues that I wrote down under this case. One, SWAT doesn't have body cameras. I don't like that SWAT doesn't have body cameras. I don't like it because of this specific incident, and I don't like it as a precedent. So it just reinforces, when we don't have camera footage, what a detriment it is to this work. We so often have the footage and it's invaluable. So I'll say that. My second issue, and I don't mean to be petty about this, but I definitely personally had really negative reactions to the sort of more military looking garb that SWAT wears. The colors and the style looks different than a police officer. It looks more combative to me, and I don't particularly care for that, particularly in a situation where people could be peacefully protesting. That feels intimidating to me. My other issues, so I particularly appreciated Leah, the deputy auditor's policy recommendations that we got at the end of this. I think they're really important points about revising the language about the 40mm sponge round usage. And so I fully support those recommendations that were made as we move forward into looking at policy recommendations. And I agreed with the auditor's recommendations for adjudication, but not the chief's. I had a hard time with the officer firing rounds at fleeing people. So the orders, it sounded like, from what I can understand, were to disperse and to make arrests when possible. I have a hard time understanding how the person was trying to effectuate an arrest when someone was running away. And when it's clear in none of these cases, they pursued those people to try to take them into custody. It seemed like there was too great a distance between the group of officers and the person. And if that was the case, then it's hard for me to believe that the intent was to ever take the person into custody. It just doesn't make sense to me. And it's, of course, further complicated by the fact that we don't have any video to review. So that's all I have to say on this case.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's always hard to go after Lindsay because she's very complete. So this was, I echo the concern. I think that I was, well, I know that I was surprised to learn that SWAT doesn't have body cameras, and I imagine that many members of the public will be surprised to learn that. I was also surprised to learn that that both was it gas vests and also pepper ball vests obscure body cams. So it seems to me that that doesn't seem like it's in the interest of the police department to as we've seen on this board, body cam footage is great for police officers who are accused of misconduct. And so that seems to be something to remedy. I think that if we've got money to spend on Bearcats and pepper balls and body cams to begin with, we should be able to figure out a way to you know, put them on different part of the something. I don't know. I don't design clothes, but that seems to me like something that should be addressed. Maybe the police commission can take that up. I was also, this is where I was thinking about the definition of the word riot. So as I read these incidents occurred on the 31st, is that correct? So I was surprised earlier when people were saying, oh, it looks like, you know, EPD learned things over the course of the weekend, because this is the end of the weekend when some of the most egregious things I think are happening. And maybe it's because people were more tired then, less on their game, more irritable, more impatient. All of that's entirely possible. But as I understand it, the protests that were taking place at this point were less violent, right? If we're going to use violence against property as the definition of violence. But it seems to me that it was clear, and certainly reading the police accounts of the weekend, that things were more organized. In fact, several times the crowds are described as more organized, as well organized even. And so this didn't seem to me to be justifiable. I think that unlike Jose, I don't mind. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't mind not following the parameters I'm given for making decisions. I think that if, you know, within policy is beginning to sound to me after a year and a half on this board a lot like I was just following orders. And I don't agree that if something's wrong, that it's okay if it's within policy. I think that if someone is at a door knocking frantically to get in, and you fire something at a projectile at them, and it hits the door as the door is opening. I mean, this is clearly, I think, a situation where, to put it generously, probably the officer's adrenaline took over. But I don't know what their motivation was. I only know that I look at this and I think this is wrong. And yeah, so I disagree with the chief on all of these, although I did agree that the one case where the woman with the hammer, that seemed like I could say, okay, I believe this is in someone's, I don't know if this is this is Mark's report. The person posed a greater threat if allowed to escape to both, that seems to me like a plausible reason for wanting to incapacitate them. Sorry. But yeah, I'm officially a no on all of them, or sustained on all of them. I'm not sure. What's the language?
You were right with sustained.
Sustained.
So you agree with the auditors.
I agree with the auditor,
recommendations,
although the
basically.
auditor found within policy for the case that I just mentioned.
The hammer incident. Okay,
hammer
just
incident.
making sure I understand. Okay, thanks.
So I would be sustained on all.
We will circle back to this after comments, going through all 4 of the allegations. It's fine.
I'm sorry, I got the, yeah.
No, it's good. I like it.
Okay, my turn. I agree with the chief's conclusion. I don't condone the use of these weapons in particular, but they are made available to the officers and they're told to use them. And 2 of the people in the brigade were given them and asked to use them and told when to use them and how to use them. And the policy relates to attempting arrests, which they were charged with doing. It should be noted that the officer who was involved in these 4 incidents was garbed in full equipment, full body protection equipment, a gas mask, a shield over his face or her face, and a helmet with the other equipment related to the impact launcher. It was for that reason that the officer did not give chase to any of the individuals, because there were other officers in the area where the individuals were running, hoping that they would be caught by them rather than give chase in this bulky outfit that the officer had. And it's also unfortunate, but it's true, that the use of these weapons is not particularly effective because the aim is not very good with them. The rounds tend to peter off and go right or left without prediction. And it's difficult to aim them when you have these gas masks and shields on. 3 of the events we're charged with here, the officer missed the individual involved with the round. There was no injury that was documented by anyone. And for us to say that this is clearly a dangerous thing or it's a situation where someone is harmed is just not right. You had a situation where one individual was running, failed to heed the officer's the order to stop, you're under arrest. He fired, missed completely, and the individual was eventually arrested by other officers in the area. The second suspect came up and banged the city vehicle with a hammer on several attempts, threw some liquid on the vehicle, and that individual was caught by the other officers, and the round missed her. The 3rd and 4th relate to the individual who was attempting to flee. One of the events struck the individual in the rear end, and he noticeably said, "Ow," and then ran into a premise. While this may not be the best situation under the circumstances, I think that it was within the policy as it's written in the policy manual.
Thank you, Rick. So I guess I want to be clear with everybody that's attending tonight that, you know, our goal, our mission is to look at these incidences and compare them to policy and make sure that they fall within the policy as they're being, and the investigation is done to do that. And so when I look at this, I think the investigation was done well. I think I had one question for the sergeant was doing the investigation, was that the deputy chief had gone through and looked at training that had been done. Is that something that you normally do, Sergeant Nelson, when you do an investigation? Do you look at how they were trained to use certain tactical pieces of equipment?
So in some cases, yeah. In this one in particular, I didn't add that in my investigation. It was something that she felt she wanted to have to make a decision. So she actually went out and got that on her own. But depending upon the case and what I think the relevance is to it, then it is something I do on certain occasions.
Thank you. Because I think that was an important piece when I went through this, is that to look at, you know, how they're trained in using this when it's compared to how it was used and their thought, you know, remembering that as you look through this, that he did tell everybody that they were under arrest, that he was in the process of making an arrest in these 4 instances. So with that, you know, I think that, you know, we looked at, and it was well done, and there was a lot of information. I think there's a lot to come out of this that we need to look at. Does our policy need to be revamped? Does it need to be looked at again? You know, both the force policy and then the use of the 40-round sponge weapon. You know, and I think that's what will come out of this. I will say though, I do, you know, it does fall within policy, but I think there's some decision-making that was probably poorly done out there by the supervisor that had this, that I don't think I agree with. I think I will admit, as I read through this and looked at everything and listened to the tapes, I actually wanted to say, why didn't he just put that thing away? He couldn't hit anybody with it anyway. And not to disparage the supervisor at all, but that's what you kind of got the feeling when you kind of went through this report. And so that I'll leave it at that. I will add one thing, is that, you know, I've always been a big proponent of body cams, and I think everybody should have them. I think we should have, on incidents like this, if there are detectives that normally don't wear them, that they're available to pick up and put on and wear whenever we have incidents like this, that, you know, whether they're riots, whether they're, you know, they're just monitoring protests or whatever it is. I think we need to have that available, because I do think that's an important part, especially for the people doing the investigations. It's a lot easier to look and see how things happened to do that. I will stop there, Carol.
I agree. Body cams for all at all times. I'm fully on body cam team. I think going through this, I appreciate all the things everyone has said. I have a few quotes from the adjudications that I will kind of speak to a little bit. I think the first one that stands out is that the 40mm launchers, is from Mark's adjudication, should not be used for crowd dispersal unless an immediate risk of injury or significant property damage exists. I think that's actually from the policy, but he quoted it in his adjudication. And I think that's important to note in this situation. Another one was that, this is also Mark, posed that the 40mm sponge rounds, is the risk is simply not outweighed by the crime of disorderly conduct. That was allegation 1. I think that also could be echoed through a lot of these. I don't think that the punishment fit the crime, so to speak. And then in the chief's adjudication, I think this is important to note, that the chief says that it is okay to quote this, right?
Yes, just don't say names, please.
Right, but I can say that it's the chief. Okay, I just did. The chief wrote, I believe that Officer A was trained based on outdated and inadequate training material. This organizational failure is a contributing factor to them using that tool in the manner under review during their protests on May 31st. It is difficult to find Officer A in violation of policy when the organization failed to adequately train an employee on what reasonably should have been done in their specific situation. It's hard to edit as I read, but I think I did it. And then the chief goes on to say that this officer is part of the training team for EPD. So then that always brings up the question of when somebody is making choices that we don't believe in, it always causes us to pause and think about the fact that they are then training other officers. And I think that that can either be used as something that can be used against the EPD, or it could be something that they can learn from. And I hope that this officer and other officers can learn from that in their training. And even if it isn't within policy, or even if policy doesn't change, training can still change, and practices can still change, even if policy isn't changed. So I'm hoping that even if the policy doesn't change, that the training can be more adequate and be more updated. And then, yeah, Leah also kind of was saying that this is something that shouldn't be in the same policy. She said all impact weapons are currently in the same policy. And I agree that I think in a lot of ways, this impact weapon should not be in the same policy. I think the fact that it looks like a gun changes how people interact with it when they're doing a protest or a riot or any sort of civil engagement. I know that there was one video, I think it was not related to this case, but there was a video of people saying they're shooting them. And I think that if there are people shouting, they're shooting them. And I don't know that we've seen these in another case, and I was like, what was that? That didn't seem, I think that was a pepper ball also. But the things that look like guns to me should be treated more like guns than a canister that's thrown, or a baton, something that is clearly not a gun. That's my thought. Before we actually, okay, so we are going to go through each of these. So there are the 4 allegations here, and we're going to go through each of them and say whether or not we agree with the chief's adjudication individually. And I don't know if we need to give details, or do we all kind of know which are the 4? We all know which are the 4, right? If we say number 1. Okay. So so the chief for all of them said that they were within policy. So for allegation number 1, raise your hand, like your physical hand, not your blue computer hand, since we all have cameras on. Raise your hand if you agree that the chief's adjudication is accurate and that allegation 1 was within policy. Oh, I should write this down. Leah, are you writing this down? Okay. And allegation 2, do we agree with the chief that it was within policy? Allegation 3, do we agree that the chief said that do we agree with the chief when the chief said that it was within policy?
I would note that I think the first round fired was within policy, but the second round I did not find to be within policy. I'm going to split your hair there, Leah. But the chief is hearing this, so it's really for him, not for you.
Did you get all that, Leah? Okay. And allegation number 4, do you agree with the chief when the chief says that it was within policy? Okay. Is there any discussion on that before we move on to whether or not to reopen it? I think go out of turn. I just opt in at this point.
So I don't think that at this point that anyone has said to reopen it. They've just either concurred or not concurred with the adjudication. And if someone else wants it reopened.
Right, we'll do that next. I wanted to see if there's any comments on the concurring or unconcurring.
Oh, sorry.
That's
I thought
okay.
you were moving all the way on to the next case. Sorry.
No. Okay. I don't see anyone wanting to discuss that. So now we'll do a show of hands about if we feel like this needs to be reopened because it was an inadequate investigation or evidence does not support the adjudication. Is that correct? Okay, so this is another show of hands. If you feel like this case or this investigation of these 4 allegations or any of the 4 allegations needs to be reopened, please raise your hand. Okay. Is there any further discussion that you would like to give to this case before we move to the next one or before we move to break? Mark?
One quick, and maybe it's for Ryan, maybe it's for the chief. As I remember, after the Babs shooting, that the EPD was going to get good cameras and audio for the Bearcat, and it just popped into my head this evening. So I don't know if Ryan has time to investigate that or not, but that was the commitment at that time, and I don't know if if the administration ever followed through on that commitment.
So I don't know all the parts of that answer for you, Mark, but what I do know is that we changed over from a vendor called Coban to Axon, and that equipment didn't get changed over in the armored vehicle. I learned that during this investigation. Now, why that happened, I can't answer that question. That's not something that I'm aware of.
Okay.
As a final comment, I just would like to say also that I really appreciate that the chief has decided to change this. This is the policy that's being revised, right? Or was revised? Yes, I saw Leo. I think that's important, and I appreciate the recognition that, particularly given the manufacturer's recommendations and the inconsistency between manufacturer's recommendations and what was the current policy for EPD, that is happening.
All right. I'm going to point out in the chat to the panelists, the chief did say that, yes, I am hearing all your comments and concerns. I want attendees to know that communication happened. Lindsay?
I've seen Jose's hand and Lindsay.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
Carolyn.
Jose and then Lindsay, or Lindsay then Jose. Lindsay's unmuted. Go, Lindsay.
Would you all be comfortable as the CRB quickly, and maybe you'll need to do this during break if this makes you feel more comfortable, but looking at Leah's policy recommendation memo, I think it seems logical that this be a vote that we make to forward to the police commission, and there's some really specific policy recommendations that seem reasonable to forward. And so if I guess my question is, do you all feel comfortable if I were to make a motion to forward Leah's recommendation to the police commission for review when this policy is being discussed there, if you're okay with that? Or do you want to take a minute to read Leah's policy recommendation memo first before we vote on that? I don't want to make you feel rushed, but it seems like a logical kind of specific set of things that I could take to police commission if that's something you're all comfortable with. Bernadette, I see your hand.
I'll second the motion.
Wait, has a motion been made? Or you're thinking of making a motion?
What is your concern? I want to make a good motion, Bernadette.
I would prefer to wait until after we have our process debrief in January to make any motions with regards to forwarding policy concerns, policy changes, because I think this has been pretty overwhelming to read all of this. And so to all of a sudden think about how the policy, I'm not saying that Leah hasn't written some great recommendations there, but that was not my focus of what this was about in the last 2 weeks. So I would prefer to wait.
And that's why I'm asking. It is overwhelming, and I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable and like you're making, specific recommendations that you want to stand behind. So that's totally fine.
We can keep these notebooks until the January meeting, right? We don't have to return them in at the 14 days.
I don't see why not.
Okay. Jose.
Hi, I have maybe perhaps a naive question, and sorry, we're doing some sleep training, so you might hear a kid in the background. I I've noticed that, for example, on allegation number 3, and I believe allegation number 4, that during the interviews, the officer involved, I believe, or the report states that the crime was disorderly conduct and curfew violation. In a pragmatic sense, how are we to parse out for example, say that there's a lot of language about protest and riot in here, right? And there's a definition about protest posted in the chat. And how are we to assess and look at, or is it even important for us as panelists to look at how those are different, and how, like, in a moment, an officer might be saying or thinking, I'm going to pursue because they are committing riot or disorderly conduct. Is this even at issue, or is this just something that is like, we can just move on. We've got what's written down.
Well, I'm just curious a little bit about what's your question? Like, it sounds like there's something you want to know.
Are officers actively pursuing people because they believe there is a riot and acting on that? Or are they actively pursuing people because they believe, because this is are we out here spraying pepper balls because of disorderly conduct and curfew violation, or because of riots? What are perceived to be riots or curfew violations?
So I can answer to some of that for you. At least for the 2 nights that I had, which were the Saturday, Sunday, most of the arrests that took place were for disorderly conduct and the curfew violation, or just the curfew violation. And so, yeah, I can't recall, and again, there's so much information, as you guys all know, I can't recall any arrest that was made on those 2 evenings for the crime of riot.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the context that I'm trying to wrap my head around to be able to assess this is, at some point a riot is declared, right? Like the decision is made that this is no longer a peaceful protest, it's now a riot. Are all of the people there committing that crime if they remain, or are they committing disorderly conduct?
No, that's a good question. I know Bernadette put in the chat over there the definition for the ORS definition for riot. And so I mean, what you can see some points in times during this thing is there are times where there actually would be by ORS definition a riot, but that could be just like for a momentary period of time. So it could actually be, okay, now this is by definition a riot, and then it disperses and moves on, and then all of a sudden there may be some individual incidents of disorderly conduct or curfew violation or something like that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that is, once it's declared, it is that way for the remainder of the incident or the remainder of the evening. Does that make sense?
That's really helpful, and I think that's the question that I was asking. So thanks, Lindsay, for helping me ask a better question.
Well, and also, I mean, I think, just to follow up, not everybody, just because a riot has been declared, doesn't necessarily mean everybody in the vicinity is participating in the riot and could be arrested for that. I think that's also something Jose was probably asking. Would that be right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Bernadette. You're absolutely correct. That does not mean that, I mean, they have to be engaged in this tumultuous or violent conduct, and other people could be standing by and not be engaged in that, and therefore wouldn't be committing the crime of riot just because they're in the area.
And if I may help as well, Jose, they had then their special investigation unit do an investigation of the crimes that occurred on those 3 nights, and subsequently certain made arrests for riots at a later date. Obviously, they didn't have the capacity to do it at that moment in time.
I see that the chief has added some to the chat. Is it appropriate to ask him to say that like with his voice so the attendees can hear also?
Chief, we can't hear you. Okay.
And I should say, I don't know that I've ever said this out loud in a meeting, but I can't follow the chat and the conversation because my brain just gets too overwhelmed. So I totally apologize if I'm not actively following the chat and you're asking me questions or something, because I probably am just accidentally rudely ignoring you. Oh, we can hear you now, Chief.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I had to switch microphones. So I apologize for the setup. I've got the laptop over here, which I'm looking at you, but then my desktop is here when I'm looking at you. So I'll try and do my best. So you guys are absolutely right. Ryan did a really nice job. So riot is a declaration that we make based on a totality of circumstances around crowd behavior that we see that's engaged in that violent and tumultuous behavior. We have a lot of discussion about whether or not we feel like it's met the elements of riot before we just very haphazardly declare that. As we've moved through the time from that May 29th, we've tried to align specific riotous behavior with the use of certain chemical munitions and making sure those only are being used with the riotous behavior. And then you're spot on with respect to coming back, and Mark articulated it really, really well, is that within that framework of riotous behavior, the specific actions of individuals that were contributing to that crowd dynamic would be charged with the C felony of riot. Now, inside of all of that, you could have people that are engaged in disorderly conduct, which is people that are blocking street or traffic, or creating a sense of chaos for people, curfew. You could even have somebody in the midst of a riot just simply engaging in graffiti and be arrested for criminal mischief, but not be arrested for riot, because that, under the totality of the circumstances, they didn't necessarily contribute to the destruction that we saw, especially on May 29th. And so we tried to be really thoughtful about that. And then as any arrests that were made on scene, specifically, we talked about, and you see the evolution of how we did this throughout the next several months into most recently, just a few months ago, how we would try to not paint the crowd with a broad brush, but try to specifically, and maybe for lack of a better term, surgically identify the instigators or the agitators and remove them from the crowd in an effort to keep the crowd dynamics manageable. And so those are just some thoughts that I had as I was listening to some of the dialogue around this.
Thank you, Chief. Is there anything else related to this case before we break? Okay, so on my clock, I see 7:19. Let's take 5 minutes and be back at 7:24. Is that good? Yes? Okay, 7:24.
Sorry, I got grabbed by a child.
I can hear mine outside my door, but I'm ignoring them. All right, Leah, do you think you could start with the case review and then?
Yes, ma'am.
Everyone else.
Yes. Okay, so it looks like, okay, so we're still missing Michael. Okay, I'll get going. I'm just catching up. All right. Case number 2. Okay, I've already moved forward in my book. All right, so this was going back in time to Friday night. There was a group of demonstrators who were walking up the westbound lanes of I-105, and 2 EPD employees drove ahead of the group to try to stop them from moving further on the freeway. They were overtaken by the crowd. One of them was trapped in their vehicle. And their windows were broken. And then Supervisor A was trying to get there to help the employees encounter the same crowd and their video caught them saying to someone in the crowd, "I'm going that way," and the expletive. So that is, again, it's against policy to use profanity when interacting with the public, so we open an allegation. Ultimately, the supervisor was able to explain why they chose to use those words. So our office in the chain of command and the chief concurred that it should be within policy. So those are your points, but you did such a good job. I obviously don't need to share. So
I have nothing to add. I think the investigation was thorough. I appreciated that. Obviously, you guys were being very thorough in reviewing video and police reports, as this was internally opened, not a citizen complaint. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. Again, this is one that's hard for me because, as Leah mentioned, despite whatever policy says, I don't know. I'm gonna come back to like being a parent. I try as much as possible not to yell at my kids, but if they're gonna run into the road, I'm gonna use an expletive and probably yell as loud as I can to keep them safe. And it seems to me that this was perhaps one of those situations where, I mean, it's not exactly analogous, but it seems to me to be contextualized, right?
I agree with everything that's been said. It also seemed effective at allowing the officer to reach the other officers who were in serious danger. And so I agreed that it should be found within policy.
Nothing to add.
I agree.
So I don't want to belabor this one, but I do remember when I was on the police commission, we had a very long discussion with the policy sergeant about the use of profanity, because we all felt very strongly about that it shouldn't be used by officers in almost every situation. And his one example was a situation similar to this one, where it was the only way to get the person to listen to him and to act. And so I do think that this was within policy, but I just wanted to say that that this discussion went on for quite some time about that. There is cases, I guess, that it does actually work.
That's interesting context. Thanks for that, Bill. I agree. It was, I don't have anything to add. So with that being said, we're going to talk about what we're going to raise our hands and say whether or not we agree with the chief's adjudication that it was within policy. So now raise your hand if you believe that it was within policy. That's everybody, Leah. And with that being said, I don't think we want to reopen it, but I will ask, does anybody feel like this warrants further investigation and should be reopened? And look at that, we gained some time back. That was great. Oh, Leah.
I wouldn't want us to get back on time. No, I just wanted to see if there were any recommendations. I didn't hear any, but I wanted to make sure I didn't miss any recommendations that you wanted to make to EPD related to this case. Lots of shaking heads. Cool. Thank you. All right, Carolyn, you want me?
I will just make one comment. This is not a recommendation. We reviewed lots of this particular officer talking throughout the night, many, many hours, and this was absolutely an uncharacteristic use of profanity. Just saying, in front of the crowd, behind the scenes, that I think it was obviously a tactical move that was effective in its application.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think that's a good point. Carolyn, do you want me to go ahead?
Yeah, let's do the next one.
Moving on. Amazing. Okay. Number 3. This was, okay, well, I'll just get going. So this was from Friday as well. Officer A was part of the field force line working downtown. This, I guess I should say, this is technically on Saturday morning, right? This was after the night had lasted for quite some time. So the officers on the line encountered some individuals who were not moving. Oh my, sorry, my chat window is doing crazy things, so bear with me. Okay. The officer pushed one of them forward with a PR-24 and that person fell. There were a few incidents that were observable on body worn where employees of EPD and other agencies were using their PR-24s to push people and the person would fall. We weren't able, I think we did our best. I think this was probably the incident that we got a complaint from the person's parent, but it is possible, I just had to point out that it's possible that that particular individual was struck by a different officer, but regardless, I felt like this incident warranted looking into. So the allegation was that Officer A used excessive force during that encounter. All of the recommendations were that this use of force was within policy. And here are your decision points, and I will stop sharing. Bernadette.
Thank you. I appreciated that in the review of the video that there were 2 incidents. And although this was a citizen complaint, when contacted, the citizen didn't follow up with EPD to know which of either one of these individuals that fell down may have been related to them. So that being said, that the auditor still went forward and was able to review what at least the Eugene officer did. I appreciated that in the first 3 cases that we reviewed, when Sergeant Barrett and Sergeant Nelson, they did videos, kind of interactive little mappy things. I always like mappy things. I like diagrams. And so fortunately, because we did those first, it made sense where these happened and where people were going. I didn't mention it in the other cases. I wish there were more indicators in the case books that indicated where they were on a case like this. Don't look at me like that, Leah. Because I think it's helpful to be able to put all of this in perspective. Because if this is happening, on a main street where there's, fewer outlets for people to disperse, is different than if you're in a larger space and you're asking them to disperse, and there's lots of ways for them to disperse to leave the area. And so I noted that this officer that was investigated looks like a pretty new officer. I appreciated how candid they were in this whole thing, and it seemed to be a good learning experience, and they performed admirably. That's all.
I have to admit, I think I missed this one in all of our information, in all of our, in all of the stuff that we have. There's bound to be one for me. So, I don't think that it's appropriate for me to add anything since I missed this one.
That's okay. We still have quorum without you.
So the thing that struck me about watching this video, first of all, it's upsetting to watch. I will admit that it was upsetting for me to watch someone get shoved to the ground. The question that kept being asked, and it was in this incident and several other incidents, especially on Friday night, people kept asking the question, what am I doing wrong? Which, while perhaps that was not the time and place to ask the question, also I can feel it feels a little bit fair. Like you're telling me to leave a public sidewalk where I am not obviously committing any other crime. And I'm asking you, law enforcement officers, what am I doing wrong? And you're saying leave. So for me, the mitigating circumstance in this whole case was the officer who did attempt to go and speak with them to explain what was going on, which I felt like was at least an effort. I don't think the civilians involved were in a position to like hear and understand, but I appreciate that the effort was made. At this point, they had already been shoved once, and so I'm sure their adrenaline was pumping. So anyway, that for some reason, that phrase that they kept asking sort of just sticks with me and sort of haunts me. What am I doing wrong? And others, they, definitely were not obeying orders to leave, but I will also say the orders weren't terribly clear, like go this direction. This is the way you need to exit. This has been declared a right. You need to leave. People are going, you're under arrest. Like some of that more clear communication that we saw more on Saturday and Sunday was absent in this early incident. And so I agree that within the totality of the circumstances was within policy, but it was still not pleasant to watch.
So I have a lot on this one. I wanted to first off to also, like Lindsay, to I wanted to flag Detective C's efforts to try to de-escalate, I guess. So there's a quote from their interview. I'd seen that initial physical interaction where the officers use their batons, how we're trained, to push people back that aren't listening, to keep moving the line, and to keep pushing riders back. I tried to just have a conversation with them at one point. They continued to just stay still. I was like, you know what? Maybe I can try and help them out a little bit and just have a conversation instead of it being just the big bad cops with batons or whatever. I just really wanted to talk to them. So I went over to them and had a conversation. Well, I wouldn't really call it a conversation because she was yelling at me the whole time, but I was trying to say, hey, I get it. You're out here, you're involved. You want to demonstrate and all that. But we got to get you this way. We have to push you that way. If you don't listen to us, they're going to have to do it physically. So I think that's really admirable, and I'm heartened. I was heartened to read that, and I felt for that detective in that interaction. I think that can't have been an easy. Well, obviously, wasn't an easy situation for anyone, but including for them. So within that context, I want to, here's where I found myself first kind of wondering about this, how we're conceptualizing violence here. And so I want to disagree with, I think this is Leah. I want to take issue with Leah's description of passive resistance. So the degree of destruction and violence, this is from her report. The degree of destruction and violence against both people and property indicated that the group as a whole was not engaged solely in passive resistance. And, you know, I understand that there were, this was May 29th, right? So there were person-to-person acts of violence that happened that night, but it wasn't clear to me that these individuals were engaging in acts of interpersonal violence. And so to say that the group as a whole was not engaged solely in passive resistance, I think misunderstands what passive resistance is. And so, and this isn't just because I did part of my dissertation on Martin Luther King, but passive resistance, right, can be a whole range of civil disobedience that aren't simply marching in a legally or even not legally defined pathway, but can include sitting in the middle of the street or in the middle of the freeway. It can include refusing to move when police tell you to move. And so I very much saw this as passive resistance. You know, may not be MLK's version of it because they're also shouting obscenities at the officers, but it doesn't seem to me that, I have trouble when we describe protesters as violent if they aren't conforming to a very, very narrowly prescribed idea of decorum, to use a word that was used earlier. And so I think that I very much appreciate Detective C's efforts to try to recognize that, what these people were doing was demonstrating. It was not rioting, and to try and reason with them. And I think it is within their rights to refuse that, to refuse to cooperate as legitimate passive resistance. And I think that that said, the first thing that you're taught when you're trained in passive resistance is that you need to expect force. You need to expect to be met with force. That doesn't make the force okay. Next thing on this, I was really disturbed at the presence of the Springfield PD for the reasons that Leah points out in her report, that there was at least one incident of a much more aggressive use of force by a Springfield, an unidentified Springfield PD officer. And this is particularly troubling to me, given I understand that the Eugene police felt overwhelmed and they called for mutual aid. I think it's worth considering whether we want that to be conditional upon the issuing of body cams to non-EPD officers who assist, and particularly these kinds of very volatile situations. I think that if we're going to rely on a police department that has a different culture and perhaps even different standards around what it expects from its officers, we should see about what kind of accountability we can place on them. So again, I'm not sure if that would be for issue for the police commission or someone else to take up. Let's see. I have also written down here that I'm sympathetic to Pitcher. So that would be Leah. I'm not sure what that refers to. Let's see if my next little sticky tab tells me.
I will sympathy for whatever reason.
Let's see. Yes, there were. When you write, the continued presence of her group pose a potentially substantial threat. So this is, again, I'm seeing that the difficulties of maintaining the line and the possibility that officers don't know who might then be behind the line if they don't keep everyone. So I'm not faulting the use of force to move the line. I'm simply defending the right of the protesters not to move. And let's see, my next point on this was that I very strongly agree with Pitcher's additional policy recommendations at the end of her report. Recommendation overall that such chemical agents, such as CS gas, get their own separate policy, and in a separate adjudication recommendation that CS gas is no longer used by EPD in crowd management situations. I think that is in keeping with the direction that a lot of forward-thinking police departments are moving, and I think that many in the nation sort of see that as a positive direction after this past summer. I think that it's not what we expect to see our officers using against demonstrators. I think it sits in my brain alongside Alabama sheriffs firing water hoses on protesters who were breaking the law in their protests. I think that we just because tools are available doesn't mean that we need to avail ourselves of them. There's a common line of criticism that one might see on social media that police feel that they have these tools, and some of them they get, I don't know if this is any case for any of the things we've been talking about, but some of them they get through military, the military program. I can't remember what the number is. I don't remember numbers well. But if they don't use them a certain amount of time, they have to give them back, right? So that kind of line of criticism exists out there. And when people see things like Bearcats driving down the street and tear gas being used, they will think this is why the police are using it, because they feel they need to, or because they have them and now they get to. And it's not a positive image for the police department to want to be out there. So even if that's not the reason why they're using them, and I'm sure it's not, it should raise concern.
I thought that this was I looked at this tape video 3 times. And I thought that in order for someone who is a citizen standing on the street there to have ignored roughly a dozen officers lined up next to an armored vehicle walking down the street, whose purpose was to merely clear the street, for them to stand there and yell obscenities at the officers at that time showed not particular good grasp of citizenship. The officers were charged with clearing the streets. They were doing that. The initial push was almost immediate on the video. There was really very little time to get used to what was happening before the initial push went and this person went to the ground. That person, after having that happen to them, continued to yell obscenities and refused to obey lawful orders. And I just don't think that the officers had any choice.
So on this one, when I always find it hard to somebody to say, well, they didn't know where to go or didn't know what to do when it's 2:14. I think if I remember the timing right on this, and this has been going on for almost 6 hours, and the alarms going off as the Bite 2 store has been broken into and looted, and the officers are lined up, like Rick said, coming down the street, that you need to move, and you need to move down and beyond. And the rest of your crowd has already figured that out too. And so I think, the officers did, their best to get the people to move, and they didn't, and they used to me, the right amount of force. And I looked at this and it's never easy when somebody pushes somebody to the ground to watch that. And I think if this wasn't in this incident with all this happening around them, that, yeah, I would have a different opinion on, using that against somebody of these people's size to just shove them to the ground twice. But this is a different circumstance, and where these groups should have known where they needed to go and needed to move on. So.
I actually don't have anything to add. I feel like everything has been covered by the people who have already spoken. So the chief said this was within policy in their adjudication. So raise your hand if you agree with the chief that it was within policy. Okay.
Real quick, Caroline.
What's that, Jose?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can just to can I record mine as an abstain from this one? Thank you.
does anybody feel like this needs to be reopened and looked into further? That is nobody, Leah. All right. Investigation number 4.
Yes, I just quickly want to say, okay, I think I gathered some recommendations from that discussion. So thank you. I appreciate that. And then I also just wanted to say to Michael, thank you for pointing that out. I think I need to be more, I think I could be more careful in my wording in that paragraph about passive resistance. So I appreciate that. I think you all know I don't mind talking about what I write. All right, I see Mark is back, but do you want to talk? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay.
No, I didn't take a break. I've been here, but.
All right. Moving to the next case. Okay, takes my computer a second to catch up. All right, case review number 4. This is an employee's use of CS gas, tear gas. So this is back to Sunday. Sorry for the jumping around in time. It made sense in my organization. Officer A was assigned to an armored vehicle that was following demonstrators giving admonishments about the curfew. The group moved towards the university, and command decision was made to use CS gas or tear gas to prevent them from entering campus area. Officer A deployed 2 gas canisters from the top of the armored vehicle, the second of which struck a person in their midsection. The allegation was that Officer A used excessive force during that incident, and the adjudications all concurred that it should be sustained. Here are your decision points, and I will stop sharing. So Bernadette, I think you're first.
Thank you. I actually have quite a bit to say about this one. This is a situation where the curfew was in place, and the officer up to this point and beyond had been courteous in spite of the immense amount of stress and knowledge that some protesters would hurt the officer if given the opportunity. It should be noted that this is the same person who was the detective in the last case that we just talked about, who was pleading with individuals to please just disperse. And while they were in the armored vehicle, they were continuing to do that, pleading with people to disperse, to just go home, that the demonstration had been going all day, and now the curfew was in place, and please just go home. This to me is a case that requires us to look not only at the rights of citizens to peaceably assemble and the press to report, but it is also to recognize that along with those rights comes some responsibilities. We've already discussed in one case in which the allegation against an officer was courtesy due to his or her use of profanity. Even in that stressful situation, the officer kept trying to be understood before using the profanity. Now we're faced with an individual that let police know they were a journalist. They shared some footage with the investigators that they were marching nearly with the police, stating consistently they were a journalist and they had a First Amendment right to be there on that sidewalk. And absolutely, they do have a right to be there. Of course, with dozens of officers on multiple scenes, that information could not reasonably be ascertained by all officers. However, members of the press also have a responsibility to not become the story, that the individual was not dressed or presenting press credentials to be easily identifiable as a member of the press gave me pause. That they knew they were filming, the individual with the press knew they were filming, and that one canister had already been deployed, yet they remained close to the vehicle. As they were hit with the canister, the unlawful use of force had been completed. The allegation will be sustained. It bears mentioning, though, that not only did the officer drop back down into the barricade, commenting to their colleagues what had just happened, that they had struck an unknown individual with the canister, and was immediately remorseful. However, the journalist then not only spewed a lengthy diatribe of profanity at the officers, but alleged that the officers could be seen laughing about the incident. And from the video, it was clear that they could not see that. Granted, this weekend was most likely this journalist's first time finding themselves in a riot situation. However, they willingly went into this situation, know what they might encounter, and therefore must, in my opinion, take some responsibility for place and certainly for lack of courtesy in the aftermath. Afterwards, the officer even commented during the investigation that this was probably a pretty scary event for the person. Contrast that with the officer who immediately self-reported at the end of shift. They offered over and over again to meet with the journalist. And why was that? Because they wanted to tell the journalist, quote, they're never going to know, they're never going to hear how I feel as a human being about it. And so, yeah, you know, I wanted to continue to try and apologize. Two further things of note. Policy 318 states two things. First, it is recognized that due to the noise of the crowd and hearing being limited by helmets and gas masks, communication will be difficult. And gas should be deployed in such a manner to encourage the crowd to move in the desired direction, which is what the officer was attempting to do in this case, was attempting to get the crowd to move in a desired direction. But between the time that they threw the first canister and they went up, down in to get the second canister and came up, the individual had moved. So while the allegation will and should be sustained, certainly there are multiple factors that should be taken into consideration with regard to the nature of any reprimand. Thank you.
So my first reaction when I saw this video was, oh, hey, that's my parking lot where I work. And I could see my office, which faces that, my window faces that parking lot. And it's just not a good look that you have an armored vehicle like this in a parking lot with what appears to be one person. What was it? Two people? Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem to me that we need to have this looks unnecessary to me. It doesn't look like there needed to be CS gas fired at this person in the parking lot of a university campus. It underscores the repeated calls to abolish the use of CS gas. And I'm not commenting on, again, what I think that an officer or this journalist is experiencing or thinking in their minds. It would be impossible for me to do so. I in that sense would like to underscore the fact that I think that one of the responsibilities and the work that I think that this committee can do is to begin to serve as a perhaps quilting point between the public and a civil institution to begin building trust. And I think that's one of that's the kind of ideological work of a group like this. And with that said, I appreciate that the officer involved, took responsibility, assisted in the investigation. And I would like to, enter into the public record my appreciation for that. Thank you.
I don't really have too much more to add. Thank you both for your comments. I think this kind of weaves in one of the comments Michael made at the beginning, this question of why and how the decision was made that preventing people from entering U of O campus was worth significant dedication of resources and uses of force. I also appreciated the officer involved after the fact. I mean, both, participating and cooperating with the investigation and also demonstrating remorse. I mean, part of the challenge in a litigious society is demonstrating remorse can be perceived as something that's actionable in a lawsuit later. And I dislike that. I think what we've learned from, for example, physicians and malpractice cases is demonstrating remorse demonstrates that you're a person who made a mistake, who understands the gravity of what you've done. And I think it's unfortunate that we prevent people the outlet to make amends, because I think that type of cancel culture just isn't really super helpful in the complex times that we live. I think it's important to try to find ways to build bridges and make amends when possible, particularly when you have a willing person who feels like they did something wrong. So I feel a lot of empathy for that. And that's all.
Excuse me. So yeah, I'm back to this because I read the things in the wrong order. I did these cases first. I didn't see any evidence that this group on this night was causing significant damage. Maybe there was some graffiti, but this was 31st. This was not the night of the looting and the fires, and this was a protest that had started at the Whole Foods parking lot and then marched towards campus. By some reports, it was a significant number of students, so it might make sense why they were heading toward campus. They're used to protesting there. It is repeatedly clear over and over again that they were not to reach campus. That was a directive from EPD, and that's why the decision was made to use CS gas. That's why the decision was made to use pepper ball, and it was not even that late, right? So this was just after 11 p.m. when these events are happening, and yeah, so I was just unclear about that, and I wish I had an answer. I again have a note that I disagreed with the description of or the definition of peaceful. I think I'm going to continue to quibble on that. I also this is where I first also became aware again that SWAT officers didn't have video, and also that the Bearcat doesn't. And I know Mark mentioned that again, and so seems like we can add a camera to that. Since it's not actually involved in, not driving into Mosul, and looking out for IEDs, we could probably put a camera on the outside of it. I think that there was a let's see, what was my other? Actually, I think that's all my, except I would just also add that I do think that a lot of this comes down to trust. So there's been a lot of conversations about the need for to rebuild trust between law enforcement and community state police. We could ask whether that trust has always existed or has ever existed with some communities. And so it might be a question more of building trust, creating it. But it's got to be two-way, right? It's not just about us trusting law enforcement. It's also about law enforcement trusting us. And when I see militarized armored vehicles and tear gas and pepper ball being used against angry, but pretty much nonviolent young people, I don't see a police department that trusts its community members. I think that when I see police departments that fight accountability and fight against having boards like this created, I don't see police departments that trust their communities. And I think that we need to see more of that trust extended from law enforcement, not just to business owners and professionals, but to the mentally ill and addicts and people who sometimes break the law. I feel like I'm veering into closing arguments.
My comments are limited to the following. I completely and totally accept the comments of my eloquent colleague, Bernadette. I thought she stated it beautifully. Thank you.
So I guess this one was actually easy for me. No matter what the circumstances is, the officers can't throw a gas can, whether it's a reporter or whether it's anybody. They have to look and see where they're throwing the canister at, and obviously he didn't do that. And so that's what it comes down to me, is that this was just a poor decision on his part. And but I do appreciate that he did come in and self-report and was willing to take the punishment for knowing that he did something that he shouldn't have done.
I'll echo that and just say that this person, whether or not they were a member of the press and whether or not that was known to the officer involved, that doesn't really matter to me at this situation. But the person who had the canister thrown at them did not pose an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or to others. They weren't attempting to flee an arrest. So there wasn't any reason to use force on them, intentional or otherwise. And I'll echo that I appreciate the remorse. That is something that we have not seen in every officer's interview. So it's always good to see that. Bernadette.
I'd just like to respond. I mean, Michael's saying that there needs to be trust and that it's a two-way street. And I think given the fact that this happened on Sunday and the behavior of individuals from Friday night, I think it's really hard to expect officers in this situation to be going down the street trusting that they're not going to start breaking out windows of the 7-Eleven right across the street from the hospital, that the university police department has been asking for some assistance, doesn't want them on campus because they're concerned. They know that they would be overrun with the numbers. So I completely agree that this is a two-way street, that we are here to inform the police as to what the community standard is, but we're also here to inform the community of what a police standard is and what the requirements are. And I think that trust also goes to a reporter who indicates that they're a reporter, but yet continues to put themselves right there, I think, in this situation that causes a distrust then also of the media that we clearly see on a regular basis. And so I don't disagree that trust needs to be built, but I don't think in this particular situation on this Sunday that we can expect the officers to just say, oh yeah, man, I'm going to trust you because Friday night was Friday night. So I just think that needed to be said.
Anything else before we move on to whether or not we agree with adjudication? Okay. The chief said that this was within policy, correct? No. Leah, explain.
It was sustained by everybody.
It was sustained by everybody.
Yes, that he violated policy.
Thank you.
Sorry, it took me a second to get to my unmute.
I don't know how I missed that one. Do we agree? Raise your hand if you agree that the chief and it should be sustained. Okay. And look at that. We are back on track. It is 8:10. Let's come back.
Hold on, Lizzie.
Oh, wait. Recommendations. Are there recommendations? Did you hear any in that, Leah?
I heard another vote for having video for SWAT and on the Bearcat. And
there's a recommendation about oh, never mind. That was the last one.
Yeah, then the not using tear gas was in the last one, but I think it probably applies here. So yeah, just okay, that's what I have. If anyone has anything I'm missing, sorry for holding my neck like that. I'm just tired. Raise your hands. Okay, good. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking now, Carolyn.
Okay, now we're behind again, Leah. Thanks for that. Okay, let's take a 5 to 6 minute break and come back at 8:17.
No. It said connecting to audio again. Seems like a good sign.
Hey, Rick, did you get my email? I know I sent it at the last minute, and I'm sorry I didn't see it until then.
No, I got it and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no worries. I saw it and I was like, oh no, he's been looking for this.
That was what I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Bernadette, do you see that chat?
I'm here.
Okay, Carolyn's having tech issues. She's asking you to go ahead and bring us back and switch that out.
Okay, yeah. Right.
Try one more thing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
All right, never mind. Okay. Michael has to have time to be outside. Do we want to give him another minute or should we get going?
It's an easy one. Let's just get going. It's an easy one. He's not the first to talk, so we'll be okay.
That's true. I am. No, okay. I will get going. First, I have to say, well done, everybody. I know this is a long one, but I'm impressed. You're still here. You're showing up. All right, case number 5. This is, well, about pepper balls. So this is back to, well, this one spans the whole weekend, I guess, because on Friday night, we start with Officer A and Officer B, who are both assigned pepper ball launchers. And on a team assisting with crowd dispersal, crowd control, they fired hundreds of pepper ball rounds between the two of them. That's a typo, I apologize. And then in reviewing video from Sunday, from May 31st, Officer F had pepper balls and Officer A, they encountered the same subject and Officer A fired about, I think it was about 20 pepper balls. And so we wanted to take a closer look at that specific incident as well. So for Officer A, the first allegation was excessive force for the hundreds of pepper balls. And then a more specific one on the pepper ball policy that Officer A used the weapon, sorry, I can't think of the right word, the tool, the weapon, when in a condition where it could affect innocent bystanders. The specific allegation for Officer A was excessive force in the rounds against that individual on Sunday. And then Officer B's allegations mirrored the first two of Officer A, mostly about just number of pepper ball and the circumstances under which they were used. The chain of command thought they were all within policy. And that was the position from our office as well. And then the chief found them to be within policy. So here are your decision points. And I will stop sharing.
Oh, I'm already unmuted. Okay. So I have to bring myself back and remember that our job here on the Civilian Review Board is to review the intake and classification and thoroughness of the investigation. And in the community impact case, we have the opportunity to make our comments before the final adjudication, as opposed to after the adjudication. And so while sometimes there are things that we might not necessarily think are the best tactical options while the officers are doing their job, it's not our job to be second guessing that at this point in time, because that would be a command decision that we would be investigating a command decision. But in this particular case, we're just reviewing whether the officers' actions that the complaint is about, whether it was investigated fully and whether we agree or disagree. And I think what was telling to me is that, again, it was only 2 officers that had this particular tool to use that at this time. And while it might have seemed excessive upon first blush, if there had been 5 people out there and 3 of them had only shot off 25 rounds and the other 2 had shot off, several hundred rounds, I think you would have a point of comparison to say one might be excessive or not. But when we only have 2 officers out there with this tool and they're both using it comparably, I think it's hard to say that it was excessive, especially also given the fact that we don't have through the investigation anything that indicates it was that anybody was injured by it, anybody was hit by it. It seems that most of them impacted the ground where they exploded or against a wall. I don't recall seeing a complaint in this section of someone being hit by it. So I think going with what our duty is to, with regards to the investigation, I think the investigation was thorough. I think if there's policy issues, we can recommend those at the end, but I think the investigation was thorough and I agree with the adjudication.
I'm going to submit to the record that I agree with the adjudication in a somewhat begrudging fashion. I think that the reasonable, I don't know if this is the right section of this meeting to say it, but I'm just going to make that cut here. The reasonable and pragmatic alternative to divestment of policing is an investment in de-escalation. And I think that, as with the case from last month, we can consider de-escalation as a kind of pre-discursive, like in all of its textures, as a sensorium. Other members of this panel have noted their reactions to the militarization of police and what that communicates visually to people. Now, again, that is me broadening out from the specifics of this individual case. So I return and say that I agree with you. I begrudgingly agree with you.
So I appreciate the level of detail that this investigation went into. One of the items that I thought was helpful for me in my understanding was looking at the training that officers receive in this particular tool, weapon. One of the slides that talks about, instructing on pepper ball indicates in bold letters that no deaths or serious injuries have been recorded for the use of this tool. And I would just like to disagree with that factually. I think, while I can't find any evidence in any kind of reliable source of deaths, that serious injuries do occur from these types of weapons. For example, blindness, hitting people in the face and neck, according to the peer-reviewed medical literature I can find, is a serious consequence of the use of pepper balls. And so I don't think officers are given the best information in this training about the seriousness of the weapon that they're carrying and the type of severity of injuries that they can cause. So I will say that. And to that point, I just want to highlight the recommendations in, I think this is Leah's recommendation. Let me double check. Yes. In Leah's recommendation, it's on the last page, just that pepper balls, we discourage the use of firing pepper balls as pain compliance, i.e. firing at humans, even in their extremities, rather than flat surfaces in situations where officer visibility is reduced. And I would just like to highlight that I agree with that, because I do think serious injury is a possibility. And that while, so there was one video that we saw where someone was alleging, I think this was a video that was submitted by a community, someone was alleging that they had been hit under the eye by a pepper ball. So I'm saying that I saw that video and I heard that, and I don't have any reason to believe that that wasn't true. So while I agree with the adjudication, the way the policy is written and the way that the officers was trained, I think that officers should be trained differently and that the policy should also be changed.
So let's see. I think I said this last time that I've actually been hit with pepper ball before, and it was in Portland by one of the feds that was mentioned during the courthouse protests up there, and I would agree with I forget which lieutenant I think had been hit with it as part of their training, and they said, you know, you can fight through. Yeah, it's not I wouldn't say it is a heavy deterrent on the scale of use of force. It hurts, but it wouldn't stop me if I was intent on doing bad things. I would say that again, so operational body-worn camera is covered by the exterior pepper ball vest. That seems like a problem. I think that there seemed to be some disagreement, if I recall correctly, in the interviews with officers as to how effective either this or the sponge rounds are in obtaining particular ends. Obviously not as effective as shooting a gun at someone. Maybe less effective than a taser, I'm not sure, but it seems to me that it's not an ideal, it doesn't seem to me to be an incredibly effective use of force. There's one point, Lieutenant C says that if you're dealing with, typically it's used in a single burst based on a given situation, they can make that decision to move it to a 3-round burst. So if you're dealing with huge amounts of crowds that are violently attacking people or officers, to get more projectiles downrange, it would be more appropriate to use a multiple burst. But then the other officer said that they were definitely using it on the multiple burst. And so there seemed to be some inconsistency in how the two officers were using the pepper balls. Let's see. There was just, again, this was the 29th, right? So this was the night of the more disturbances. But I'm trying to be sympathetic toward that, and I am sympathetic toward that, the difficulty of the situation, and the degree to which officers were outnumbered, which is brought up over and over again. So estimates run from 600 to 1,000 people, and the number of officers is obviously many fewer than that, at least 10 to 1 outnumbered. But again, I wonder, like, if you have in a town the size of Eugene 1,000 people who want to burn down the courthouse, I think we need to ask really difficult questions about what's wrong with our society, that would be people's response. And I mean, that's not an insignificant amount, that's not an insignificant number of people and if there are 1,000 people who are that angry, and I don't think they were going to burn down the courthouse, but that was one thing that was alleged as something that had been a belief that was held. I don't know. I just think that we need to think about what we're responding to and why we need this kind of police presence to respond to that many people in our community who are that upset I obviously don't think that anyone should be throwing rocks, bottles, bricks, or shooting fireworks at police officers. Obviously, I don't think that. I hope it's obvious I don't think that. But I think that that can't just be because there are hundreds and hundreds of bad people in Eugene who need to be put down and brought into order. I think that, and maybe that's just my belief, but I think that it is something that we need to have as a serious conversation in our community. But I agree with the adjudication.
I think our duty here is we're charged with looking at what happened, whether there was a violation of policy that was committed by an individual or individual officers. With all due respect, Michael, I don't think that it's necessary for us to get into the philosophy of the treatment of people who want to burn down buildings or anything like that right now. I think we have to look at whether or not the officer violated the policy. And I have to think that that is not the case given the circumstances. So I would uphold the ruling that it's within policy.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. You know, this one brings up, and I appreciated that it took both of the sergeants to do this investigation on the number of paintballs used. You know, the question is when is it too many that they're using? I think that's what I struggled with in all of this. If it, you know, in one of the comments by one of the, I think it was Officer A, I thought I shot 1,000 rounds of pepper balls. When it turned out, it was like 250. So it sort of gives you the idea that they thought that they were shooting a lot more than he was. And so, and that's where I kind of get to where in the moment, you know, how many is too many in this thing? And so, you know, I do believe that it was in policy, but I think this is always going to be a hard one. I do think this was an effective tool. I think as we saw through videos and other pieces of the information we received in this, was that it did make people move in directions when they fired at their feet. And so I do think, you know, this is one of those use of forces that, you know, has less potential to actually harm people if it's used properly than others, but I'll leave it at that.
All right, I think I want to talk about, it's in one of the inquiries where it's about pepper ball use, but I think that my question maybe fits in this discussion a little bit better. So in that one, do you all know what I'm talking about? The other one? Okay. I think that it was Ryan who explained that about half of the officers have inert pepper balls. So I'm curious about if they're not meant to fire them at bodies to cause pain, what's the point of having inert pepper balls? Which, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody said it was baby powder. That's what the people said, but I don't assume that it actually is baby powder. Does it like give off a cloud that makes people think it's pepper, or can you explain that, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best. I'm not, I don't carry it, and I haven't gone through the training, but from what I understand, based off of it, is to give people the impression that it is pepper ball, or it is actual pepper powder that comes out. So it's one of those deals where, you know, they see the powder come out, they think it's going to be an OC powder and it's going to be an irritant, and so it forces them to move in a different direction. So you're not firing the OC spray or the OC pepper every single time you fire the gun.
Okay, and then connected to that other case again, or that other inquiry, it said that the certain officer who had that pepper ball gun everything in there was the inert stuff. Is that typical that like an officer would have all inert or all powder? And then do they know what they have before they start firing it? Because I feel like that could play into their feelings of how they would use the gun. If they know that it won't actually cause eye irritant, then maybe they would be more likely to even subconsciously aim it like a paintball gun, for example, or fire more of them, knowing that it's not actually an irritant.
Sure. No, I hear where you're coming from. I mean, they still have to follow the policy the way it's set, and that's obviously not something that they're able to do via the policy. As far as answering your question related to is that normal, I don't know the answer to that. What I can tell you, and I think you've probably seen it, all of you have seen it in the reports, is that after Friday night, we were pretty depleted in our resources and availability of gas and pepper ball. A lot of rounds were fired. How that is dispersed to each individual officer, I don't know the answer to that question. Whether or not they receive all inert or all active pepper balls, I don't know. But I do know that we were, or officers, not we, because I wasn't there, but officers that were on scene were trying to find additional pepper balls and CS gas throughout the night. So I don't know if that played into it, but I can imagine that could potentially have been.
Okay, thank you. Are there other recommendations that you need to tell Leah? Or Leah, do you feel like you have them all? Or am I skipping ahead? Do I usually do it at the very end? Okay, let's vote. Wait, I see a hand. I saw a hand. It went down.
Lindsay, it's Lindsay.
Lindsay.
It was just me. I'm sorry. And then I realized I don't think it belongs here, but I just wanted to make this statement. This was the section of video where there were, I don't know that I'd call them protesters, but other members of the community claiming they were armed, yelling at police officers that if you don't do your job, I will. And I just want to say, like, just bring up that when people don't perceive officers to be doing their job, it puts them in this particularly awkward position of trying to maintain some kind of semblance of order, and also prevent other protesters from being harmed by other people who are claiming, and I have no reason to disbelieve, have weapons that could harm them in sort of a vigilante style justice. So I just made a note to myself that this was particularly, there were some really tense moments in this video that gave me great pause, and I think played into the way that I perceived how this all played out. Thank you.
If we're going to call the protesters, I think we call the other people counter protesters. And if we're going to say that the protesters were not being violent because they were causing destruction to property, I don't think we can call counter protesters vigilantes. I mean, it's like there are two sides.
I think there's a difference between saying I'm going to cause physical harm to someone with a firearm and someone tagging graffiti. I'm just going to categorically say those are different things.
Except that we had protesters grabbing a rifle from a couple that was trying to get out of the area.
I get that. And I'm not talking about them. I'm actually talking about other business owners who were saying I'm armed and I'm going to shoot people if they come and loot my business. And I'm just calling out that there were other people who were claiming they were armed, who were not cleared from the area, who were not arrested, who I think were a threat, and that officers were like threading that needle, and that was dicey and very tense. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, anything else before we raise our hands? Okay, everybody said this was, oh wait, this is like 5 different things, right? We go one by one on this one. Yeah. So allegation 1, these were all found within policy though, correct, Leah? It's late.
Yeah, I think I think it seems to make sense to me in the interest of time to just ask about concurring with the thing overall. And then if anybody says, no, I agree with 3, but not 4, like we can go from there.
Okay. Okay.
Do you guys all concur that all of these were within policy? Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That was good job, guys. Carolyn, I wasn't trying to jump in. I was trying to suggest wording.
I think that it was clear that it needed to happen. Does anybody feel like we need to reopen this for further investigation? Okay. Leah, do you have recommendations?
The recommendations I have are working on training and policy to recognize that serious injury can result, working on the issue of vests covering the cameras. I think that's what I have. And then the ones that I wrote, that there was some echoing of the ones that I already wrote. In the
Don't shoot at people.
There you go.
Yeah. Moving on then.
Sorry. Okay. You guys, I can't write that fast. That's why I type things. Okay. I think this might be the last adjudication, you guys.
It is.
Woo. I'm very impressed. Okay. Last allegation. Sorry. So this was one that came up during review of a body worn camera. Supervisor A, this was on Friday night, early Saturday morning. Supervisor A was issuing directions to officers who were going to go be in the field force team. The words were questionable. So the allegation was that the supervisor illustrated poor judgment. The chain of command and auditor and chief ultimately believed it was within policy, but well, let's hear what you guys have to think. So here are your decision points. Bernadette.
Sorry, I didn't tap it right. I think what stands out for me is when the supervisor was contacted and asked about this, I think I just need to read some of what was said, because I think it's pretty telling what was going on after this many hours of chaos. There were points where we really started to address and move the crowd where the crowd was pushing against us. We really started to address and move the crowd where the crowd was pushing against us. I could just see, here's this wide-eyed, like saucer-eyed officers who had no idea what to do in this situation and were underprepared, undertrained, and under-equipped to deal with this. And supervisors who had never been in this situation leading these people. And I'm trying to kind of orchestrate the overall performance of what we're doing. It was one of the very few times I was scared, like something really bad could happen to everyone here, to our people as well. Being in this position that I was in, I felt responsibility for each and every one of those people and their safety because of the position I had put them in that night. There was just a lack of preparation. We hadn't had any riots for probably a good 10 plus years, and the department really wasn't training to any degree for these situations. I was incredibly frustrated. I was incredibly tired. And obviously the supervisor goes on from there. But I think that to me was so telling of the situation that they were dealing with, and that they had no previous knowledge that this was going to start up on Friday. There was some talk about, other protests, but they were not ready for this. Many officers had not been involved in anything, whether we call it a demonstration that got out of control, whether you want to call it a riot. The Halloween events that happen in the university neighborhood nearly every year for several years were always contained and in the university neighborhood, and not nearly as chaotic as this incident. And the officers were prepared for it every year. And so now we have a lot of really new officers who have never been in a situation like this. And I think the language that the supervisor had to use in this situation to motivate the individuals to be prepared for how the rest of the night was going to go, let alone the rest of the weekend. I agree that what was said was within policy. I don't think the words were used in any way to indicate that the officers should be going out and causing harm to individuals whether they were the rioters, whether they were protesters, or whether they were just civilians exercising their right to walk around the streets. That's all.
Okay, so I got just a couple of things to say about this one, and I'll really try to make it brief, noting that it's 8:45 p.m. I study how people are persuaded. I'm into informal logic and informal reasoning, and my comments and the type of comments that I've tried to make have been in that spirit, that people are persuaded by what they feel. People are persuaded by what they see, not necessarily all the time by the reasoning that they're consciously or semi-consciously going through. To that degree, I want to make my comments in the spirit of what do we want to communicate to the people of Eugene when we think about policing, and when we think about these decisions that are in my mind made in the spirit of communicating what the policing apparatus is doing in response to these, how it's learning. We've all noted that we appreciate when we see remorse and we see like metacognition and reflection and action based upon that. So that's what I want to say. What do we want to communicate? One of the things that I'm glad that Bernadette brought up was the quote where the officer involved said they were tired. Let me note this Supervisor A had mentioned I'd been working for a minimum of 15 hours straight. I'd like to know why someone is in this situation after being there for 15 hours straight. I don't think anybody is capable of making good decisions, especially in a situation like that one, after doing that. I can only have my fight or flight response elevated for a few minutes before I get that like adrenaline crash. I cannot imagine what these people's bodies are how much demand is placed on an individual's body when they're in the situation. This is a workplace issue. It's a problem. It needs to be addressed. We need to figure out, okay, I completely agree. People are making sometimes bad decisions, but we're placing them there. If somebody had died in one of these situations, it would be really difficult to argue that the officer was individually responsible for that. So to me, this is a labor issue that becomes a public interest issue. In the interest of the public, we need to address this. That's my second comment. Then, again, as Bernadette brought up, time and again, we see in these interviews that officers note that they're afraid. So if we have officers who are underprepared and undertrained, and I say this with all due respect to the chief and the command, why are we deployed? Why are they being deployed if, as was noted, they're not trained in any degree? It just seems like we're putting people in situations to make difficult decisions, and there's a pattern of them sometimes not making good decisions. I try to say that as like objectively as possible here, and without like assessment of who they are as people, but just what we see happening. So within that context, I was kind of again, the person in me responding was upset when I read that, this officer involved says, do whatever you have to do to make sure our people safe. But on the previous page notes that if somebody needs to take a 40 round, give them a 40 round. You guys with pepper ball guns, anybody starts trying to come up past us or flanking us, light them up. Doesn't sound like we're trying to keep people safe. But again, I make this comment noting that this person had unfair, and in any other industry, we would be like, excuse my language, fuck that. Nobody should be working under those conditions. It's inhumane. So as much as I try to preface that, I'm still upset, and I think this to me is kind of like, it goes beyond the old like ball coach language at halftime, like, we're gonna go out there and get them. It's frightening to me that in the public, language that's being used to keep people safe is justifying violence.
It's interesting, Jose. I appreciate being able to hear what other people have to say to kind of reflect it off of the notes that I make. So something that I've said before and something that I'll say again is that if we want a well-being centered public safety apparatus, we have to consider that officer well-being has to be at the center of that. And I think that's what you have very eloquently identified for me in this particular incident that I didn't flag for myself. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's important. How can we expect care from people who haven't been cared for? It's not reasonable. So thank you. I agree. And I was kind of looking at language, thinking about, I'll be interested to see what Michael has to say. I am not a textual analysis expert. That's not what I do for my bread and butter, but I am interested in affect, and I am interested in how we talk about things. And this idea of who are we and who are they came up in this, right? So there's a couple times when I'm telling you to do whatever you need to do to keep all of our people safe. And this is about protection of our safety. And I would like every day of the week to believe that I am part of that we when it comes to EPD and protecting safety. I would like to be considered as part of that group of we. Who are we and who are they? I would like to be considered as one of we, not one of them. And so I agree with what you say, Jose. And while I find the us versus them language troubling, it also seems understandable from that internal point of view in the context because of the circumstance. So I agree with the adjudication, and it just, anyway, brings up a lot of things. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I don't have a lot to add. I agree with the adjudication on this one. I found the language, I guess, disturbing, but not especially under the circumstances. I found actually the justification of the language using the sports analogy and the coach to be more disturbing because of the signaling of an us versus them. I think if you were coaching a team and you told your team to go out there and break some spines, and that happened, that would not be a good thing. So I do think that there are limits to what one advocates even in those contexts. I don't think that the words that were actually said cross that line for me in this case under the circumstances. But I don't like that we're thinking about law enforcement in the community as opposing sports teams. I think that that's almost as troubling as seeing them as enemy combatants. You know, this was an extraordinary situation, and we want law enforcement to be problem solvers. Obviously, that can't be the case in every scenario, and this is one of those extreme cases. So I agree with adjudication.
I agree with the decision. It was within policy.
So this one was actually very tough for me since this is one of our supervisors who is speaking this way. You would think, you know, and I've talked a lot about that this is through this tough evening, but this is where I expect the supervisors, the command staff to step up, to be a little level higher than the people below them and be able to speak and be able to talk and motivate them in the right way. And especially you have, you know, it goes back and says there's a lot of young officers. Well, are they going to take him literally? Are they going to take him to say that, you know, this is what, you know, I need to do then, you know, and not just take it as the motivation? And so I think it's very troubling that this is found within policy to me as from this person. And I get it. And I'll make one other comment to this is that, you know, when we talk about the us versus them, that night, there was a lot of people that were there to hurt the police. And there was a lot of people that were trying actively to hurt them. So there was a little bit of them against us, and they needed to protect themselves. So I get that, but that doesn't still, I don't believe the way he spoke to them was the motivational way you do as a supervisor, as somebody in the chain of command, when you're talking to a group of people that are under extraordinary circumstances. I'm just very disappointed that this was found within policy.
I really appreciate the back and forth with this one. And Jose, I think the way that you put that was what I was trying to get at earlier, was saying like that we don't have enough officers in the department, but also do we need to defund the department? It's a question that I grapple with a lot. And not saying that that's what you were saying, but it's what it echoed that for me. And I appreciate your perspective, Bill. I think that's an important thing to look at. And I will vote in just a minute. And I think that it was within policy, but I also was leaning toward it was inappropriately within a policy. And I hope that there was some thought afterward about that. So raise your hand if you feel like this was, that the chief's adjudication was correct when the chief said that it was within policy. All right. And then is there any reason to reopen this investigation? Okay.
Can I just make a clarification? The chief hadn't ruled on this one yet, right? It looks that's just all we have is Leah as our last. Is that right?
Sorry. So you should have one from the lieutenant that got concurred by, it was like the captain. So on some of these, I printed them out before the chief had put his initials on them, but he concurred with the recommendation of the chain of command. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So that is the end of our investigations.
Lady. Sorry.
What recommendations do you need, Leah?
Well, I wanted to just let you know which ones I'd written down.
Okay.
I
just trust that you write them all down and then we can move on.
I need to make sure I didn't miss anything. Officer well-being and training, two big ones. And then there was a lot of talk about us versus them. So I said us versus them and guardian mentality. Okay, seeing nods. That's
you had it. Wait,
oh,
there's more.
Jose.
You know, could we, yeah, I was really impressed. What Bill said impressed upon me quite a bit, that I think I value that idea or that philosophy about leadership as well, that we should hold leaders in organizations to a different kind of standard. And yeah, it comes to me, especially as you had said, did I get this right in that you knew this person, or that you knew this situation? I don't know. I think, can we add that in some way to what you recorded?
Yes. Yes. Holding supervisors to a higher standard kind of thing. Expecting them to be leaders. Yeah. Okay.
I think that applies to multiple cases. We have people in leadership positions in multiple cases who've been considered in these adjudications, sergeants, lieutenants, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I meant to point this out earlier, just for the attendees. When we say Officer A, Sergeant A, Supervisor A, it's not the same person for each case. It's a different A in each case. I think that was probably clear, but that occurred to me halfway through that we should make it clear that it isn't the same person in all of these, doing these things.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just have one thing to say, and that is because I was hearing, like I've heard a couple times, like begrudgingly concur kind of thing, and I tried to make this clear in the adjudication recommendations that I wrote, but I think a lot of these behaviors, while ultimately I may have recommended that they were within policy, it does not mean that I condone the behaviors or thought they were great. I think that the reason a lot of these drew scrutiny is because they don't necessarily meet expectations. So I felt like that was a good time to say that. So I will let you move on.
I think that was clear, and I think that was clear in not just your adjudication. It was clear in the chiefs from the first one we did and other ones too. So I think it's important to say that sometimes it isn't the officer at fault, it's more the policy at fault, or both. So that's important to pay attention to. Are we moving on? Okay. So the next thing on our agenda is the review of related incident reviews, inquiries, and service complaints. I count 6, but maybe it's 7 because the one that was on the thumb drive but not in the book. So it's 7. Yeah, that we looked at.
It's 7. Yeah, I
Okay.
made a list, but I don't think you guys really need the list. Do you
Right.
want the list? No.
So we have 7, and we're not going to go through each of them one by one. What I wanted to do was just put it out there and ask if there's any of these that any of you would like to have a discussion on or have questions answered about. So that's where we are now.
Do you want to go in the order just to make sure we get?
Sure. Okay. So the language quoting counter protester. I did want to say, I did break.
I meant in order of the people.
Oh, in order of the people. Yeah, that's one way to do it. We could do that.
Bernadette's happy with me right now.
Well, I mean, Lindsay was able to say that, she gets to hear other people's comments before she makes any comments. So the fact that I have had to go first on every single one of these cases required me to have my thoughts put together and articulate without the benefit of hearing other people's positions. And it's been helpful, but it's also been pretty frustrating for me because, obviously this is a completely different meeting than we've had in past. And so with regards to the final cases that we have, I've reviewed all of them. I don't think there was anything that jumped out at me. Again, I think I was just appreciative that because the auditor and the internal affairs took the time to look at every piece of body worn camera and every report and, all of the questions and comments that came in. I think that's helpful. I think one of the things that, as people have been making discussions is they're talking about, they don't like the military police presence. And in one of the reports, they talked about how the organizers of the Sunday event were very clear about saying, we want you to disperse now. We do not want you to engage in violence. And so my question to all of the people here that are saying the police shouldn't have pulled out the pepper ball, the police shouldn't have brought out the sponge rounds, the 40mm sponge rounds, is where's the responsibility of those protesters that continue to protest and march around the city? Where's the responsibility of them to self-police? That if you think the police were overreaching in controlling the actions and the directions of the people, then where are the people that are keeping them from blocking the streets where ambulances might need to get into the hospital over by the university, blocking the ability of people that want to go through an area to get home? Where's the responsibility for those activists to engage with members that are marching with them and telling them enough, get out of the street, cars need to go through. So that's my comments.
So are we going in order, or do people want to respond to that? I don't know. Going in order? Okay.
Cortez, you're up.
Is this the time for general responses to response, or okay, yeah, I mean, I think that I know this is not the space to have this kind of impact. I just think that when we, if my take on all of this is that again, I'll say it, the reasonable and pragmatic alternative to divestment of policing is an investment in de-escalation, and that means rethinking the communication, what showing up in a tank communicates. The fact is, we live in a historical context where many of the people alive look at what happened at Tiananmen Square, and they can't necessarily separate that out. Again, this in my research, this is how people are persuaded. They take things and they make associations, they logical or not. And it could be the case, perhaps, that it would satisfy people on any side of the article, any side of the aisle, to see a less militarized police presence, because whether you look at anybody who's a leftist or a Republican, doesn't matter what part of the political spectrum you're on right now. Everybody has a kind of like distrust of civic institutions. And I think that that's a bad thing generally. I think we want to trust that our civic institutions have our best interests in mind. And that includes policing, that includes corrections, that includes, universities. So I would just like us to think, what does showing up like that communicate? And how can we communicate to the public that we're reflective, forward-looking? And we had a really good example of an officer today who did that, made a judgment, reflected, took accountability, and then thought about some pathways for change.
Thanks, Bernadette, and thanks, Jose. Bernadette, you're right. You've been on the hot seat all night, and it's really hard to lead off in the discussion and then hear other things and not necessarily have a chance to integrate all the comments. So I appreciate that work that you've done tonight. On these 7 additional cases, what I appreciate is the transparency. So I appreciate that the allegations were brought, or concerns were brought forward, that they were seriously investigated, that I can see the materials, and that I also agree that nothing else needs to happen with them. That's a ton of work that a lot of people did and that I can see, which I appreciate, which increases my trust in the system, which is important. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say about this section. I appreciate that when people saw things, people who were reviewing these things, so this means internal people, whether they're EPD people or auditor people, internal people to the process, saw things that they thought, that might be concerning to someone, particularly if it was taken out of context, that they said, let's flag it, let's look at it, let's have other people look at it, let's send it to the CRB. That for me is a really good process. So I appreciate that it happened, and I don't have any further concerns on these 7 issues.
So I had a question about one of them, and excuse me, it was the other Pepperball one. So the case of the inquiry regarding a male being struck in the face with pepper ball on Sunday, the 31st. And this was came to light because of a Facebook Live video by an independent reporter. And since it was on Facebook Live, I'm just going to go ahead and say that the possible first name of the male was Preston. So maybe if Preston's out there, he could clarify this for us. It just was unclear to me what to do with this. I put a big question mark on my paper because we didn't have, right, the inquiry didn't go anywhere because it wasn't clear. It wasn't possible to substantiate this. And so I would just observe that. But otherwise, I didn't have any other comments on these 7 items. I would just say that we've talked about trust, and I do very much recognize and want to acknowledge the incredibly hard work that went into analyzing all of these this body cam footage and doing the investigations and writing the very careful adjudications and recommendations. It is not work that I would want to do. So I appreciate it and have benefited from it in doing this. I think that work is often invisible to the community, and I think it's important for them to know that this does take place, and there are dedicated professionals who are caring about this. And I think it's unfortunate people don't know how much work goes into it, because I've been interviewing community members about the oversight processes, and in the words of one fairly well-informed person, this board is a distraction and a waste and a number of other things. And obviously I wouldn't be spending my time on it if I agreed with that, but I think that is a perception out there, and it's important to acknowledge the hard work that goes into making this not just a distraction. So thank you.
Thank you, all of you. I appreciated all of your comments over the last 3 or 4 hours. And I've come to agree with almost every one of you at one point or another. Particularly the last comments that you made, Michael. I think that's very apropos. I think that there's been a lot of hard work done, and it gets pretty easy to say, well, they're just a bunch of older citizens who are engaged in this activity for their own benefit, but that's we take it seriously, and it's a concern that I have. The comments that Jose made, that we're placing people in situations where they're not trained, they haven't experienced this material before, this type of situation, and at the same time, out of the other side of others' mouths, we're talking about defunding these people and taking away the assets that they have in order to perform these functions. And I think that would be a disaster. I can't imagine what the citizens of this community would have said had that we sent out 50 social psychologists to stop the riot at 7th and Washington. We put these officers in a real tough situation. We don't give them enough assets and training, and I think that they did a pretty good job.
So on these 6, 7 cases, I think it goes to show that our process, that we are looking internally, we are looking at it. As Bernadette started out this meeting with saying that the majority of these reviews that we did tonight were internally generated. They were generated either from the department or through the auditor's office, which it says we're making progress in our oversight and our review of how we're being policed and looking at that. With that, I will say that I am still a little confused that in the IA system things like people failing to follow orders make it into that system, and that just isn't handled as a performance review. I think this is the second time we actually looked at a case earlier in the year, and now we have another one in this section here where I don't understand why that gets an IA investigation or an auditor involvement when that should be done through command staff. But things are done differently in the department than in outside world where I work, where we handle those things. And I'm gonna throw in my closing comments now, Carolyn, and I apologize if you don't want me to do that, but I figured I might just speed things up in the end. But I want to make just a couple comments because I heard throughout the evening people talk about property damage and we shouldn't, use force or go in there. But, I deal with a lot of business owners and a lot of people that their livelihood is in that building. Everything they own, everything that takes care of their family. And if it gets destroyed, insurance doesn't just come in and fix their lives. It destroys their lives, and it has in many riot situations across this country, and it happened in this. And so, when we talk about that, and I work downtown and we have 70 some employees that work here. And if our building was burned to the ground because somebody didn't like what was happening in the world, what would we do with those people? Where would they go? They would lose their job for at least some point of time. And so we have to think about those things when we're looking and we say that, the police should just let them do whatever they want because they're just breaking a window or, and if they break one of our windows, they could still, things that have people's personal information on it. And so, that's what we have to think about. And we do need them to respond and to do that and not criticize them for that, because it is, this is people's livelihoods that, you may look like a piece of property to you, but if they came in and destroyed your house and you had nowhere to live, you wouldn't be happy that the police let them do that. So I just want us to think about that as we look at these things in the future. Thank you, Carolyn, for letting me do that.
Just to clarify, Leah, we don't need to vote on opening these or adjudication because they're not adjudicated and they're not open. Okay.
I don't see a need.
Right. So we can go into closing comments. Thank you, Bill, for starting that off, making Bernadette not have to do that. You took the easy one. Go ahead, Bernadette.
Okay, so the Public Assemblies and Demonstrations Policy 316 of the Eugene Police Department outlines the responsibilities and procedures for sworn personnel. Generally, their duty is to protect life and protect personal and public property and maintain public peace. That's a lot of things to do. Those are ands, not ors. The cause of racial injustice may have taken a backseat to our discussion tonight, just as it did over some of the weekend events that we have discussed. It is interesting for me to note that there was no discussion with regards to the racial injustice protest meeting that happened over in Alton Baker Park, that peaceful, no problems with that. The cause for racial, there are those in our community that were marching for this very righteous cause, but their words were lost in the chaos that ensued. This was mob mentality. Good people out for a good cause getting swept in the maelstrom of emotions and actions. Does burning and looting a business help the cause of racial injustice, especially when there is no allegation against that business? We have stated that many officers were afraid that night. Officers preventing personal injury protect the statutory and constitutional rights of all parties involved. That had been on the force for 10, 20, and nearly even 30 years, had never been a situation of this magnitude that caused this kind of fear. And then they went home to their families, and they came back to work the next day, knowing what some of the protesters were capable of doing. Yet they remained on the job. They did their best to protect life and the constitutional rights of all parties involved. So to the demonstrators that were out there peacefully marching, that went home and did not violate the curfew, I thank you. To the officers that protected those same people, I thank you. I am forever grateful for Cahoots, who in the aftermath of so many national events is touted as an example of what a community can do when resources are tight. I look forward to policy discussions that will happen and the changes that the chief has already mentioned. I thank everyone for their time and effort tonight.
I want to say thank you as well, as well to underscore the work that goes on behind the scenes to make this possible. On a philosophical note, that, as I mentioned earlier, the destruction of private property is as American as apple pie is. That was a constitutive. That was one of the constitutive acts that made this a sovereign nation. Now, saying that does not mean I condone destroying private property. I myself do not engage in those acts. But I make that comment to make it clear that it's likely that this is a problem that is not going to go away, and it's not going to be snuffed out via violence necessarily. So I would like to make those comments to set up this next one, which is this is very clear that this is a labor issue that becomes a public interest issue, and that we need to, if the goal is not divestment but investment, then it needs to be invested not in military equipment, but in perhaps setting up officers to have livable working conditions first and foremost, humane working conditions. And second of all, that I don't think that it would be too difficult to think, or too difficult to see that. I don't think it would be difficult to see that necessarily. That's not mutually exclusive. That thinking about investing in officers' livelihoods could very well be a way of increasing de-escalation tactics or supporting them.
Thank you, everybody who's commented before me. I'm just gonna note the last thing that I noted in my binder, which was basically that we would like to take a closer look at policy 316, 317, 318. Those are, I think, all, yep, James Hill specials. Those haven't been revised since 2001, so I look forward to looking at those in the next meeting. I also flagged some just question marks in policy 800 and policy 808. So there's a lot of policy work that's going to come after this too, and I look forward to doing that. I really appreciate serving on a board of people who are careful and considerate, who take the many hours. Like, this was like a full-time job for me, at least the last couple weeks since I've had this binder looking at this. And I appreciate that each person kind of hones in on a different thing, and we can only do that in teams. We can only do that kind of work in teams. There is no one person who can do that work. So without a team of people looking at this with bringing their whole selves, their life experience and their, training and their education, we can't do this work. So I appreciate that you're all willing to do that and do that voluntarily. I really appreciate it. And I will still stand by the, while I do not condone in any way destruction of property, losing a job is not the same as losing a life. You can get a new job, you can't get a new life, and that's a serious thing. And so it's serious work that we're doing, and I appreciate that you're all showing up to do that, and I appreciate all the community members who have stuck with us to this late hour to hear these conversations. I think this is an important work that we're doing, and it's hard and it's messy, and we will disagree, and I think that's okay, because I think that's part of like the process of doing work in this kind of community and this kind of team. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. I also want to say, because my own experience as a webinar attendee is that it's frustrating because you don't know how many other attendees are there. So I just want to let the community members know that there have been as many as 40 and as few as 29-ish people, other community members watching. So you haven't been alone in your on your computer watching us. Bill, you're absolutely right that the origins of modern policing has to do precisely with the protection of the property of upper middle class people like myself. That is why police exist. If we had a society in which things were more equitably distributed, we wouldn't need police officers to protect private property from people who didn't have private property. That said, thank you, Burnett, for bringing up racial justice. The riots don't happen out of nowhere, and over the last 100 years in this country, almost every urban riot has been precipitated by police actions. Not always, but often against African Americans. Harlem in 1935, I wrote these down. Rochester in 1964, Harlem again in 64, Philadelphia in 64, Watts in 65, Newark in 67, Cleveland in 68, Omaha in 69, Miami in 1980, Washington, D.C. in 1991, Los Angeles in 1992, Cincinnati in 2001, Benton Harbor, Michigan in 2003, Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, Baltimore in 2015, and all across the country in 2020. Americans don't just riot because we want to riot. Americans riot almost exclusively to protest police brutality in their own community or someone else's community. And I think that a highly militarized response to those riots is missing so much about what those riots are about. These riots have been studied since the 60s intensively, and there's unanimity among sociologists about what leads to urban unrest. And it is inequality, it is lack of access to jobs and opportunity, and it is police violence.
I don't have any comments.
First of all, Michael, thank you for that. I think that if I could say something, I would say what you just said. So I'll just underscore that and thank you. Also, I really want to thank Leah for all the work she did on this. I think that this was a big task for her. And Jason and Ryan, also thank you so much for putting it all together. The videos that you both made were extraordinarily helpful. Like Bernadette, I like little maps and charts, and it was really, really helpful to wrap my mind around what had happened. Obviously, the rest of Leah's office and Mark's office I appreciate that. All the work that you all do. And this board. I know that this was, like Lindsay said, it's a full-time job on top of everything else we have going on. So I appreciate you volunteering to do this and volunteering to serve on the board at all. So that's really, I think, where I'll leave it for tonight. Unless anyone else. Leah, Mike, wait, Michael, are you waving or are you raising your hand? Leah, raising your hand. Okay. Leah, you have
That's
to
so
say
fast.
something.
Really quick. I have to thank you all for being so thoughtful and so careful and so studious. I really appreciate Mark did a lot of this, Vicky and Beatrice did a lot of this with getting word out to the public, and I think our office was tested this year, and I think I'm really just proud to be a part of what we did. I have no idea how many hours I've spent on this project, but I have to tell you all that those hours were made immeasurably easier by knowing I was bringing this work to a group that would look at it fairly and honestly and with integrity and with thoughtfulness. And I really did look forward to hearing this discussion. So I appreciate you all bringing your perspectives and your honesty here tonight. So that's all I have.
All right, we will see you in January.